Did you know that during the Cold War, there were an estimated 50,000 spies operating across the globe? Secret agents, double crosses, and codes. Espionage has always been a hidden, dangerous world. But what happens when these covert operations make their way into history? Welcome to Obscure Chronicle. In tonight's episode, we're diving into the shadowy world of espionage, exploring the lives and legacies of some of the most famous spies in history. From secretive missions to breathtaking betrayals, these figures helped shape the course of global events. The challenge with espionage is knowing who truly made an impact. Spies often operate in the shadows and their actions are wrapped in secrecy. But for those whose stories have surfaced, their influence is undeniable. Who are the spies whose actions swayed the course of wars? And how did they manage to stay hidden in plain sight for so long? From legendary double agents to the quiet, unseen operatives, we'll explore how they changed the game, sometimes with just a few whispered words or a carefully planted piece of information. Let's begin by diving into the stories of a few of the most iconic names in the espionage world. Mata Hari, the dancer-turned-spy who captivated a nation's secrets. Aldrich Ames, the CIA agent who betrayed his own country. And even James Bond, the fictional character whose influence on espionage is felt to this day. We'll explore their lives, their techniques, and the lasting impact they had on the world of intelligence and international diplomacy. What made them effective? How did they live with the constant threat of exposure and betrayal? But there's always a defining moment in a spy's life, the one action that either solidifies their place in history or exposes them to the world. For some, it was a stunning betrayal. For others, an intelligence leak that changed the course of war. Take Aldrich Ames, for example. His espionage for the Soviet Union led to one of the most dramatic intelligence failures of the Cold War. Or the story of Mata Hari's trial, where a woman suspected of betrayal became the face of espionage's dark side. From Mata Hari's fateful espionage to the quiet shadows of Cold War spies, the world of intelligence is rich with stories of intrigue, danger, and personal sacrifice. These spies, whether real or fictional, have shaped history in ways we may never fully understand. Who's your favorite spy? Comment below and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss more peaceful journeys through history. For those who love espionage, we have more in-depth videos on the world of spies and secret agents. Join us for the next adventure. The wind howls across the streets of Paris as the lights of the city flicker, casting long shadows on the cobblestone roads below. The year is 1917, and the world is in the grip of war. Yet, in the heart of the French capital, amid the chaos and the bloodshed of World War I, there is another story unfolding, one that takes place in the dimly lit corners of cafes, in the opulent ballrooms of Parisian society, and under the haunting gaze of a woman who would become one of the most famous spies in history, Mata Hari. Born Margareta Gertrude Zell in 1876, Mata Hari's early life was far from the exotic allure that would later define her. She was raised in the Netherlands, a country far from the glamorous stage of Paris. As a young woman, she was married off to a much older Dutch colonial officer, Rudolf MacLeod, and moved to the Dutch East Indies. However, their marriage was a troubled one. She struggled with a foreign land, a distant and often cruel husband, and the oppressive expectations of society. In the midst of it all, Mata Hari felt the weight of isolation and repression, but she was also determined to break free. It was in the Dutch East Indies that her transformation began. The experiences she had in Indonesia, surrounded by exotic landscapes, a foreign culture, and unfamiliar customs would later shape her persona as a dancer and courtesan. Mata Hari became fascinated by the idea of mysticism, the exotic and the untold allure of the unknown. This fascination would ultimately lead to her reinvention as the seductive and enigmatic persona she would adopt in Europe. Her marriage ended in divorce, and she returned to Europe in search of a new beginning. In Paris, the city of lights, she reinvented herself as a dancer, captivating audiences with her mysterious allure. She adopted the stage name Mata Hari, meaning Eye of the Day in Malay, and crafted a persona that was a mix of the mystical and the sensual. Her performances were unlike anything Paris had seen before, exotic, seductive, and alluring. She was draped in sheer fabrics, performing dances that invoke the image of an Eastern goddess. Soon, Mata Hari became the toast of Parisian society, performing in high-profile venues such as the Folies Bergère, where she gained fame for her provocative acts. She was a woman of contradictions, a courtesan, an entertainer, and a woman who claimed to possess the mysterious powers of an ancient temple dancer. In a city renowned for its creativity and decadence, Mata Hari became the embodiment of both fantasy and allure. Yet, beneath the glamour and the makeup, something darker was at play. During this time, World War I raged on, and Europe was divided between the warring factions of the Allies and the Central Powers. The world was filled with spies. On both sides of the conflict, intelligence operations were underway to gain an advantage. And it was here, amidst the smoke and mirrors of Parisian cabarets, that Mata Hari would find herself thrust into the world of espionage. The story of Mata Hari as a spy began to unfold in the most unlikely of places, the lavish salons of Paris. In these social circles where power and wealth mingled, Mata Hari attracted the attention of several military officials and diplomats, each eager to exploit her influence and charm. Through her relationships with wealthy men, both French and German, she cultivated a web of connections that spanned both sides of the conflict. But it was not just her beauty and charm that made her valuable. It was her connections to high-ranking military officers, some of whom were involved in secretive dealings. Mata Hari's espionage career remains shrouded in mystery. Some historians argue that she was a double agent, working for both the French and the Germans. Others suggest that she was in fact manipulated by both sides, a pawn in the complex world of espionage. The truth remains elusive, but what is known is that her actions during the war were seen as treasonous by the French. It all began in 1916, when Mata Hari was recruited by German intelligence. The Germans, eager to gather information from within French military circles, saw her as a valuable asset. Mata Hari in turn saw an opportunity to play both sides against one another, using her position in Paris to extract intelligence. But as the war raged on, her involvement with the Germans would eventually lead to her downfall. Her interactions with German military officers were seen by some as flirtations, by others as serious breaches of loyalty. Mata Hari's espionage activities remained mostly covert, but by 1917 suspicion began to mount. She was arrested by the French police after being accused of passing vital military secrets to the Germans. The charges were serious. She was accused of providing the Germans with information that led to the deaths of French soldiers, and her actions were seen as directly contributing to the weakening of the French war effort. The evidence against her was largely circumstantial, and many historians still debate the extent of her involvement in espionage. Was she a spy, or was she simply caught up in a game of political intrigue that she did not fully understand? Her trial was swift, and the French court was determined to make an example of her. Mata Hari was charged with espionage, and despite her insistence of innocence, she was found guilty. On October 15th, 1917, Mata Hari was executed by firing squad in the French countryside. Her execution marked the end of her tumultuous life, but it also solidified her status as one of the most famous and controversial figures in the world of espionage. The legend of Mata Hari, however, did not die with her. Her story became one of the most enduring myths of the 20th century, a woman who danced her way into history, playing both sides of the conflict and becoming a symbol of mystery and seduction. In the decades that followed her death, Mata Hari's name would be associated with intrigue, glamour and danger, and she would become a fixture in popular culture. Writers, filmmakers, and artists would continue to draw upon her image, creating a persona that was equal parts femme fatale and tragic figure. But beneath the legend, the truth about Mata Hari's life and her role in World War I remains elusive. Was she truly a spy, or was she a woman who was used and discarded by those in power? Her execution, and the mystery surrounding it, has led to endless speculation and debate. Was she guilty of espionage, or was she a scapegoat in a world at war? Perhaps, as with all great historical figures, the answer lies somewhere in between. Mata Hari's life and death serve as a reflection of the complexities of espionage and the blurred lines between loyalty, betrayal, and survival. She lived in a world where power was defined by secrets, and where trust was a luxury few could afford. She was a woman of ambition, mystery and charm, caught in the crossfire of a global conflict, her name forever etched in the annals of history. And as we reflect on her story, we cannot help but ask ourselves, in the world of spies, where is the line between truth and illusion? In the end, perhaps Mata Hari's greatest act of espionage was not her work for the Germans, but the persona she created for herself, a persona that has fascinated and intrigued generations of people ever since. The world of espionage is often romanticized in books and films, filled with thrilling escapes, covert operations, and shadowy figures, but the life of one of its most famous spies, Mata Hari, was a tale of complexity, mystery, and ultimately tragedy. Mata Hari's real name was Margaretha Geertrude Zell, born in 1876 in Leeuwarden, Netherlands, and her story is one of reinvention, intrigue, and cultural conflict, all set against the backdrop of a world at war. Her journey from a small-town girl in the Netherlands to the infamous exotic dancer and alleged spy in Paris is a remarkable and often misunderstood transformation. But at its heart, it is also a story of a woman defying expectations, creating a new identity, and stepping into a world where espionage and entertainment intertwined. Mata Hari's early life was far from glamorous. She was born into a middle-class family in the Dutch province of Friesland. Her mother died when she was young, and her father, once wealthy, lost much of his fortune. Despite these early hardships, Zell was educated and grew up in a world that encouraged young women to be modest and dutiful. She was no exception at first, but as she grew older, she began to question the confines of her upbringing. By the time she was in her early 20s, she had married a much older man, Rudolf MacLeod, a Dutch colonial officer stationed in the Dutch East Indies. The couple moved to Indonesia, and here Zell began to encounter a vastly different world from the one she had known in Europe. The exoticism of the East, the cultural freedom, and the allure of the unknown began to shape her identity. She was captivated by the art, mysticism, and sensuality of the region, which would later fuel the persona she would become famous for. But her marriage, like many in her life, was fraught with difficulty. MacLeod was abusive, and the marriage quickly soured. Eventually they separated, and Zell, now known as Mata Hari, returned to Europe. In Paris, Mata Hari reinvented herself. It was here that she would shed her former life, adopting a new name, persona, and career. Mata Hari, which means Eye of the Day in Malay, was a name that embodied the mystery and allure she sought to project. She quickly became known for her exotic performances, which blended dance, sensuality, and mysticism. Her shows, inspired by the dances of the East, featured scant clothing, veils, and movements that hinted at the forbidden. In a city already filled with artists and performers, Mata Hari's unique style of dancing set her apart, captivating audiences who flocked to see her. Paris in the early 1900s was a city of decadence, bohemianism, and modernity, where the line between art and reality often blurred. Mata Hari fit seamlessly into this world. She was the embodiment of the exotic other, a woman who didn't fit neatly into any category. She was both an entertainer and a mystery, a courtesan and an artist, a subject of fascination and scandal. As her popularity grew, so did her circle of influential admirers, men from high society, diplomats and military officers, all captivated by her beauty and charm. But beneath the surface of this glamorous life, there was an underlying tension. In her pursuit of fame, Mata Hari had made connections with powerful figures, some of whom were involved in the conflict that would soon engulf Europe, World War I. The war, which started in 1914, reshaped Europe and the way nations engaged with one another. It was a time of paranoia, distrust, and espionage. With military secrets being exchanged at the highest levels, it was only a matter of time before the world of politics and war would intersect with the world of performance and seduction. In the midst of World War I, Mata Hari's relationships with influential men, particularly military officers from both the French and German sides, would make her a potential target for espionage. The French authorities began to take an interest in her, suspecting that she was involved in spying for the Germans. It was rumoured that she'd been recruited by German intelligence in 1916, though the true extent of her involvement remains unclear. Her role as a dancer and courtesan in the heart of European society gave her unique access to high-ranking military and government officials. She was the perfect mole, charming, confident, and able to move freely between the upper echelons of both the French and German social spheres. Mata Hari was rumoured to have acted as an intermediary, passing on military secrets, sometimes unknowingly, through her connections with high-ranking officers. Her influence over powerful men in both the French and German military made her a potential asset to both sides, and she was soon suspected of being a double agent. The exact nature of her espionage remains a subject of debate. Did she knowingly pass information to the Germans, or was she simply caught in a web of intrigue? Was she truly a spy, or was she an unwitting pawn manipulated by both sides of the war? Some historians argue that Mata Hari was far more innocent than she was made out to be, a woman who was used by both the Allies and the Germans for their own purposes. Others claim that she was indeed a spy, deliberately offering her services to the Germans in exchange for money and luxury. One of the most poignant aspects of her story is that Mata Hari's alleged espionage was likely exaggerated. Despite the suspicions and rumours surrounding her, there is little concrete evidence that she provided significant intelligence to the enemy. However, in the context of wartime paranoia, suspicion alone was often enough to condemn someone. Mata Hari became a symbol of the dangers of espionage, and her execution served as a chilling reminder of the consequences of betrayal, real or imagined. Mata Hari's downfall came in 1917 when she was arrested by the French police. She was charged with espionage, accused of being a German spy who'd caused the deaths of French soldiers by passing on vital military secrets. The evidence against her was circumstantial, consisting mostly of intercepted correspondence and the testimony of military officials. Her trial was swift, and despite her protestations of innocence, she was found guilty. Her trial, held in Paris in 1917, became a media spectacle. Journalists and onlookers filled the courtroom, eager to catch a glimpse of the exotic dancer who had captivated the world. Mata Hari's defense was weak, and her attempts to appeal to the court's sense of fairness failed. In the eyes of the French military, she was already guilty, and her trial was little more than a formality. On October 15th, 1917, Mata Hari was executed by firing squad in the French countryside. The execution was carried out in the early morning, and she reportedly walked to her death with dignity, refusing to be blindfolded. Her final words, if they were spoken, have been lost to history. Some say she called out, "Hail France," as the soldiers raised their rifles. Others suggest that she was silent, resigned to her fate. Whatever the case, Mata Hari's death marked the end of her tumultuous life, but it also ensured her place in history as one of the most infamous figures of the First World War. Mata Hari's legacy as a spy is one that blends myth and reality. She has been immortalized in literature, film, and popular culture, often depicted as a femme fatale, seductive, dangerous, and mysterious. Her story continues to capture the imagination of people around the world, but the truth of her espionage activities remains unclear. Was she truly a spy, or was she merely a woman caught in the winds of war? A scapegoat for a system that needed someone to blame. In the years following her death, Mata Hari became a symbol of the dangers of espionage, a symbol of a woman who lived in the shadows, navigating a world of deception and betrayal. Her name became synonymous with mystery, and her story continues to fascinate those who are drawn to the world of spies, secrets, and international intrigue. Though she was executed in the name of justice, the true nature of her actions remains shrouded in uncertainty. Was she the calculating spy that history has often portrayed, or was she simply a woman who got caught in a web of deceit? Regardless of the answer, Mata Hari's name has become etched in history as one of the most enduring and enigmatic figures of espionage. The Cambridge Five, 5 men whose names would forever be synonymous with treason, deception, and the secrets of the Cold War. In the shadowy world of espionage, where loyalty and betrayal often walk hand in hand, their story stands out as one of the most astonishing, shaping the intelligence landscape of the 20th century. At the heart of this tale lies not only espionage, but also a web of shifting loyalties, idealism, and the delicate balance between national allegiance and personal belief. The men involved in this covert network, all of whom had been educated at the prestigious University of Cambridge in England, were deeply embedded within British society, each playing crucial roles in key intelligence and political institutions. To the outside world, they were pillars of British intellect and government, respected figures in high society. But beneath this veneer of respectability, they were working for the Soviet Union, betraying their own country during one of the most tense and dangerous periods in modern history, the Cold War. The 5 men, Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, were recruited by Soviet intelligence during the late 1930s and early 1940s, a time when Europe was grappling with the rise of fascism and the looming threat of Nazi Germany. What began as a seemingly innocent ideological commitment to communism evolved into one of the most devastating acts of espionage the world had ever seen. At the centre of the Cambridge Five stands Kim Philby, perhaps the most famous and notorious of the group. A charming, intelligent man with an air of sophistication and ease, Philby was an upper-class British gentleman, a perfect disguise for his secret life as a Soviet agent. Born in 1912 into a prominent family, his father was an English diplomat and his uncle was a well-known historian. Philby was raised in an atmosphere of privilege and intellectual curiosity. It was at Cambridge University that Philby became involved with communism, influenced by the political climate of the time. The rise of fascism in Europe and the Spanish Civil War made many young intellectuals gravitate towards the idea of socialism as a counterbalance to the growing threat of totalitarian regimes. Philby, along with his fellow spies, believed that communism was a worthy cause, a belief that led him to become a Soviet informant. Philby's career in British intelligence began in the 1940s when he joined the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, also known as MI6. With his talents for networking and his natural charm, he quickly rose through the ranks, becoming a trusted officer. During World War II, Philby's position allowed him to feed crucial intelligence about British operations to the Soviet Union, significantly aiding the USSR's military and political efforts. He was assigned to work with the British intelligence services in Washington, D.C., and later in Turkey, positions that allowed him to pass on vital information to Soviet handlers with little suspicion. However, Philby's actions were not without consequences. His betrayal of his country's secrets during the Cold War was catastrophic, particularly when it came to his work surrounding the British intelligence services and the relationship between the US and the UK. During the height of the Cold War, Philby's actions were discovered, but his true role as a Soviet spy was not exposed until later. The news rocked the world, especially Britain, where Philby had been a well-respected figure. Philby's true motivations remain a subject of intense debate. Was he a true believer in communism, or was his betrayal driven by personal ambition and disillusionment with Western politics? What is clear is that his ability to navigate the world of espionage, play both sides, and successfully mislead his colleagues and the British government for decades is a testament to his cunning and deceit. Maclean and Burgess, the second and third members of the Cambridge Five, were equally intertwined in this web of deception, though their paths to espionage were slightly different. Both Maclean and Burgess were recruited by the Soviet Union during their university years and had strong personal ties to Philby. Their commitment to the Soviet cause, however, was driven more by a deep ideological conviction than the more pragmatic motivations of some of the other members of the group. Donald Maclean, born into an aristocratic family with connections to British diplomacy, was an idealist who saw the Soviet Union as a beacon of hope for the working class, a stark contrast to the inequality he witnessed in his own country. He worked as a diplomat first in the British Foreign Office and later in Washington, D.C., where his position gave him access to some of the most sensitive diplomatic cables and classified information. Guy Burgess, on the other hand, was flamboyant, charismatic, and deeply involved in both British politics and the Soviet espionage network. Known for his wit and social circle of powerful individuals, Burgess's persona was hard to decipher. But behind the mask of charm and cleverness lay a man dedicated to the Soviet cause, using his position in British government circles to feed the Soviets with valuable intelligence. In a strange twist of fate, Burgess and Maclean were both caught spying for the Soviet Union, and in 1951 they were abruptly recalled to the Soviet Union after their cover was blown. Their dramatic escape, leaving their friends and colleagues in shock, has become one of the most well-known stories in the history of espionage. Both Maclean and Burgess's actions were driven by their disillusionment with British foreign policy, especially in the context of the post-war geopolitical landscape. To them, the Soviet Union offered a more just and equitable society, and they were willing to risk everything to provide valuable intelligence to the USSR. While Burgess and Maclean were known for their outgoing personalities and political ambition, Anthony Blunt was far more reserved and in many ways the most enigmatic of the Cambridge Five. A distinguished art historian and scholar, Blunt served as the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, making him a highly respected figure in British intellectual circles. His position gave him access to a wealth of sensitive government documents, and it was here that he passed on valuable intelligence to his Soviet handlers. Blunt's involvement in espionage was kept secret for many years, and it wasn't until the 1960s that his role as a member of the Cambridge Five was revealed. Unlike the others, Blunt maintained a relatively low profile and was able to avoid the public fallout that came with their exposure. His quiet nature allowed him to blend seamlessly into the background, and even after his betrayal was discovered, he was granted immunity by the British government in exchange for his cooperation in identifying other Soviet agents. Blunt's motivations, like those of the others, were largely ideological. As a committed communist, Blunt believed that the Soviet Union represented a true alternative to the capitalist West. His betrayal of Britain was rooted in a desire to support the Soviet cause, although it also came with the personal cost of living a life of constant secrecy and tension. The last member of the Cambridge Five, John Cairncross, was the least well-known of the group, but his role was no less significant. Cairncross, like Blunt, was an intellectual, a linguist, and a man whose loyalty to the Soviet Union led him to betray the country that had given him so much. A former British civil servant, Cairncross provided the Soviets with valuable information about British and American intelligence during the war. His betrayal would have significant implications for British and American intelligence operations. Despite being somewhat of a shadowy figure, Cairncross's role in the Soviet spy network was integral. His quiet, unassuming nature allowed him to avoid detection for a long time, and he continued to work within the British government until his exposure in the 1960s. Like the others, his motivations were ideologically driven, but the personal cost of living a life of secrecy was something that Cairncross would have to bear for the rest of his days. The story of the Cambridge Five is one that has fascinated historians, intelligence agencies, and the general public for decades. Their betrayal has left a permanent mark on the history of espionage, and their actions continue to shape the world of intelligence to this day. In some ways, they were idealistic men caught up in the tides of history, believing that their actions were justified by their political beliefs. In others, they were simply pawns in a dangerous game, willing to sell out their country for the promise of a better world that never materialized. The fallout from their exposure led to a deep distrust within British intelligence, a lasting reminder of the dangers posed by ideological loyalty and the fragility of national security. While some view them as heroes, others see them as traitors who jeopardized the safety of their own people. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, shaped by personal beliefs, political realities, and the complexities of human loyalty and betrayal. In the shadow of the Cold War, espionage was a shadowy game of secrets and betrayals, with men and women on both sides of the ideological divide maneuvering in a complex web of intelligence. Among these clandestine figures, the Cambridge Five, a group of British spies who secretly worked for the Soviet Union, are often seen as the most famous and consequential of all. Their actions not only shaped the intelligence world of their time, but also altered the trajectory of the Cold War, with repercussions that are still felt today. These men, recruited during their time at Cambridge University, played a pivotal role in leaking some of the most sensitive information from British and American intelligence. The group's core members, Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, each brought unique skills and personalities to the espionage network, making them both extraordinarily effective and ultimately disastrously hard to detect. At the heart of the Cambridge Five story is the ideological environment of the 1930s. The rise of fascism in Europe, combined with the effects of the Great Depression, left many young intellectuals disillusioned with capitalism and traditional Western democratic ideals. Cambridge University, known for producing some of Britain's brightest minds, became a fertile ground for the recruitment of Soviet spies. Many of these young men, including Philby, MacLean, and Burgess, were drawn to the promises of communism as a means of combating fascism and inequality. The Soviet Union, which appeared to be an egalitarian alternative to the rise of Nazi Germany, became an ideological beacon for them, even if it was in reality a totalitarian state. It was here, at Cambridge, where they first began to discuss and debate radical political ideologies that were drawn to Marxism not just as an academic theory, but as a potential solution to the socio-political problems of the time. The communist ideology seemed to offer answers in the face of rising fascism and the economic struggles of the working class. The connection between their studies and the espionage network they would eventually join wasn't merely opportunistic, it was ideological. Kim Philby, the mastermind behind the group, was undoubtedly the most important and complex figure in the Cambridge Five. Born in 1912 to a prominent English family, Philby was well-educated, urbane and cultured, traits that allowed him to move seamlessly in elite British and American circles. He was recruited by Soviet intelligence in the late 1930s, while still a student at Cambridge, through his friendships with communist sympathizers. Philby's charm and affable demeanor made him both a highly regarded figure within British intelligence and the perfect cover for his work as a Soviet agent. Philby's rise within British intelligence was meteoric. After the war, he secured a position in MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, and was stationed in Washington, D.C., as a liaison with the CIA. His role in the intelligence community gave him unparalleled access to top-secret information, which he steadily passed on to the Soviet Union for nearly 20 years. His work included handing over vital intelligence regarding the Western powers' plans during the early years of the Cold War. Philby's ability to deceive his colleagues, including high-ranking British officials, was astonishing. As he rose to power within WWII, his Soviet handlers trusted him with an increasing number of top-secret operations. This included leaks about atomic bomb developments, which were vital to Soviet military strategy. He was also responsible for tipping off the Soviets about the covert operations of the United States and its allies during the Cold War, undermining the security of the Western Bloc. Philby's downfall came in 1963, when he defected to the Soviet Union, just as suspicions about his loyalties were surfacing. However, by then, he had already caused irreparable damage to British and American intelligence operations. His defection sent shockwaves through the intelligence communities of both countries. His betrayal was a stark reminder that even those trusted with national security could harbour deep ideological loyalties to a rival power. While Philby's charm and suave exterior helped him maintain his cover, Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess were both more overtly committed to the Soviet cause. Maclean, born into an aristocratic family, was recruited by the Soviet Union in the early 1930s when he was still at Cambridge. He was an idealist who saw the Soviet Union as a bastion of hope for the working class, and he fully embraced the ideals of Marxism. His loyalty to the Soviets ran deep, and he provided the USSR with critical information about British diplomacy and intelligence throughout the war and beyond. Maclean's role was centered around his work as a diplomat in the British Foreign Office. As he moved through various positions, he gained access to classified diplomatic cables and other high-level secrets, which he passed on to the Soviets. Despite his ideological zeal, Maclean's career was fraught with tension, especially in the 1950s, as the Cold War escalated. His position within British foreign affairs gave him ample opportunity to engage in espionage without raising suspicion. But in 1951, just as the British authorities were beginning to close in on the Cambridge Five, Maclean and Burgess fled to the Soviet Union, sparking an international scandal. Guy Burgess, unlike Maclean, was more flamboyant and socially outgoing. His charm, wit, and eccentricities masked the seriousness of his espionage activities. Burgess was recruited alongside Maclean and was an equally committed communist, determined to see the Soviet Union prevail over the Western capitalist powers. Burgess used his position as a broadcaster for the BBC to move freely within British political and diplomatic circles, passing on valuable information to the Soviet Union. His actions were pivotal in compromising British intelligence efforts, and his betrayal, like Maclean's, was a major blow to the British establishment. The two men's dramatic flight to Moscow in 1951, abandoning their posts without warning, left the British intelligence community in disarray. Their defection further cemented their status as traitors in the eyes of the public, and it made them infamous figures in the world of espionage. While Philby, Maclean and Burgess were the more prominent members of the Cambridge Five, Anthony Blunt and John Cairncross played equally significant roles in the group's espionage activities, though their stories were more quietly devastating. Blunt, an art historian by trade, worked for British intelligence during and after World War II. He was recruited by the Soviet Union as a member of the Cambridge Five during the late 1930s, and he served as a Soviet agent for years without detection. His role within British intelligence was not as high profile as that of Philby or Maclean, but his access to classified materials, particularly concerning government documents, made him a valuable asset to Soviet intelligence. Blunt's role remained hidden for many years after the discovery of the other members of the Cambridge Five. He continued his career as the surveyor of the Queen's Pictures, a prestigious position in British society. It wasn't until the 1960s that Blunt's true loyalty was uncovered. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Blunt cooperated with authorities and provided information about his espionage activities. John Cairncross, the least-known member of the Cambridge Five, was a member of the British Civil Service and worked as a cryptographer during World War II. Like Blunt, Cairncross used his position to pass on secrets to the Soviet Union. Though Cairncross's betrayal was not as high profile, the information he provided to the Soviets was invaluable, particularly regarding British and American intelligence during the war. The Cambridge Five's betrayal was devastating, not only because they had passed on critical military and diplomatic information to the Soviet Union, but also because they had done so while serving in positions of trust within their own government. Their espionage activities have been seen as both a testament to their ideological commitment and a tragic example of how loyalty to a cause can, at times, eclipse loyalty to one's own country. Their exposure in the 1950s and 1960s caused a seismic shock to the British intelligence community. The revelations led to widespread fear of Soviet infiltration within other parts of the British government and military. The damage they inflicted was immeasurable, and their betrayal remains one of the most infamous in espionage history. Though the world of espionage has continued to evolve, the legacy of the Cambridge Five is undeniable. Their actions were a stark reminder of the ease with which loyalty can be manipulated, and how deeply personal beliefs can alter the course of history. Today, their names live on in the annals of espionage, a chilling reminder of the stakes of international intelligence and the fine line between patriotism and betrayal. Among the numerous spies who played pivotal roles during World War II, few are as inspiring and as understated as Virginia Hall. Despite facing significant personal challenges and operating in secrecy, Hall became one of the most effective and fearless agents of the Allied forces. Her contributions to the French resistance in Nazi-occupied France are legendary, and her remarkable story is one of quiet strength, courage in the face of adversity, and unwavering persistence. While many of the great espionage figures of the war are well known for their daring exploits and dramatic missions, Hall's story is less about the overt thrill of espionage and more about the subtle, relentless effort required to help defeat Nazi Germany. With a prosthetic leg, which she called Cuthbert, Hall carried out dangerous and crucial operations in the heart of enemy territory, defying both the Nazi forces and the entrenched social expectations of the time. Virginia Hall was born in 1906 in Baltimore, Maryland, into a well-to-do family, and though she had access to the privileges of the American elite, her path was anything but conventional. Raised with a sense of independence and intellectual curiosity, Hall quickly gravitated toward a life of adventure. After graduating from Radcliffe College, she worked in various diplomatic and foreign service positions, which eventually took her to Europe. It was during her time in Europe that Hall's life would take a dramatic turn toward espionage. In 1933, while travelling in France, Hall suffered a tragic accident that would change her life forever. While hunting in the countryside, she accidentally shot herself in the leg, and doctors were forced to amputate it. However, rather than succumbing to despair, Hall displayed incredible resilience. After the accident, she was fitted with a prosthetic leg, and rather than allowing the loss to define her, Hall adopted the attitude of a determined, adventurous spirit. She would go on to call her prosthetic leg Cuthbert, a name that would remain with her as a symbol of strength in the face of adversity. Despite her disability, Hall's ambition remained unshaken. She continued her career in the American diplomatic service, where she worked for a time as a clerk for the US Embassy in Warsaw. However, it wasn't long before Hall grew disillusioned with the limitations of traditional diplomacy, and the outbreak of World War II would offer her a new opportunity, one that would place her at the forefront of the Allied intelligence effort against Nazi Germany. Hall's entry into the world of espionage began when she was recruited by the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, in 1941, an organisation designed to conduct espionage and sabotage operations behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. The SOE had developed a reputation for recruiting some of the most daring individuals, and Hall, despite her physical handicap, quickly caught the attention of her British handlers. Hall's knowledge of Europe, her linguistic skills, and her deep desire to combat the growing threat of Nazism made her an ideal candidate for their clandestine work. After undergoing rigorous training in the UK, Hall was inserted into France under the cover of an ordinary American woman. She was given the task of organising resistance movements in Nazi-occupied Vichy France, and despite her disability, Hall quickly became an invaluable asset to the Allies. Her work in the French resistance was critical. Operating primarily in the area around Lyon and Marseille, Hall developed connections with various underground groups that were working to subvert Nazi control in France. Her work was incredibly dangerous, not only because of the threat posed by the Nazis, but also because of the constant danger of being captured by the French Vichy government, which collaborated with the Germans. Hall's ability to gather intelligence was unmatched. She communicated with London regularly, passing along detailed reports on German military movements, troop deployments, and other critical information. Hall was especially adept at building networks of trusted operatives who could carry out sabotage operations on German supply lines, thus disrupting their ability to wage war. What made Virginia Hall so remarkable as a spy was not just her bravery or her cunning intelligence, but her ability to operate quietly and persistently in the shadows. Unlike many of the spies we imagine today, daring figures with dramatic escapes, Hall's operations were grounded in secrecy and subtlety. Her greatest asset was her ability to work discreetly, often blending into the background, never seeking the limelight. In fact, she became so good at maintaining her cover that the Nazis never suspected her for months, despite the fact that Hall was one of the most wanted individuals by the Gestapo. They had given her the code name La Dame qui boite, the lady who hobbles, a title that highlighted her disability but also underscored their inability to catch her. Hall's perseverance and careful planning allowed her to continue operating within France's resistance movement for years, coordinating successful missions and feeding critical intelligence to London, all while avoiding detection by both the German and Vichy forces. One of her most successful missions involved helping to coordinate the escape of more than 100 downed Allied airmen, ensuring their safe passage out of occupied France. She also played a key role in sabotage missions that successfully disrupted German communications, forcing the Nazis to divert critical resources away from the front lines. Despite the danger, Hall was always calm and collected, even in the face of extreme peril. She knew how to play the game of espionage, operating with a quiet resolve that made her an exceptional asset to the Allies. In 1942, after a year of highly successful operations, Hall's cover was nearly blown. A turn of bad luck, a tip-off from a collaborator, led the Gestapo to begin tightening their search for her. The hunt for La Dame qui boite became a major priority for the Nazis, and Hall's situation grew ever more perilous. Her carefully constructed network in France began to disintegrate under the pressure of German occupation, and it became increasingly difficult to maintain communication with London. Despite the constant threat of capture, Hall continued to evade the Germans, using her knowledge of the French countryside and her deep understanding of the Resistance's network to keep one step ahead of her pursuers. The French resistance, along with the support of the British intelligence community, managed to help Hall escape France just as the noose began to tighten. Hall was extracted from France and sent back to London, where she was honoured for her extraordinary bravery and contributions to the war effort. Her work helped pave the way for the eventual liberation of France, and her legacy as one of the war's most successful spies was solidified. Virginia Hall's story stands as a testament to the power of perseverance and courage. She fought against the odds, not only in the shadow of war but also against the personal adversity of living with a disability. Despite the many challenges she faced, Hall's impact on the Allied war effort was immense. She remains one of the most celebrated spies in history, not because of flashy operations or daring escapes, but because of her quiet, unrelenting determination to make a difference in the fight against tyranny. Hall's espionage career was celebrated, but her life after the war was far less public. She continued working for the CIA, where she was respected for her work and contributions to intelligence, though she remained largely out of the public eye. Eventually, she retired and lived out her later years in peace, away from the limelight. Her legacy, however, endures. She's been recognized as one of the greatest spies of the 20th century, and her story has inspired countless individuals, especially women, who see in her a figure of strength and resilience. Virginia Hall's life demonstrates that heroism does not always come in grand gestures or loud proclamations, but in the quiet persistence of those who refuse to be defined by their limitations. Her story remains a reminder of the bravery it takes to stand firm in the face of overwhelming adversity, to fight for what is right, and to keep pushing forward when the world is in turmoil. Virginia Hall's legacy as one of the most successful spies of World War II remains one of the great untold stories of espionage. In a world that often celebrates larger-than-life figures, Virginia Hall stands out not for dramatic escapes or flashy operations, but for her sheer persistence, courage, and the quiet strength with which she carried out her work. Despite facing enormous personal adversity, chiefly the loss of a leg in a hunting accident, she became an invaluable asset to the Allies, working tirelessly in Nazi-occupied France to gather intelligence, sabotage German operations, and support the French resistance. What makes Virginia Hall's story particularly remarkable is how she defied the traditional expectations placed on women in the 1940s, especially in the world of espionage, which was often dominated by men. She entered this clandestine world in the midst of a raging global conflict, with nothing but her wit, determination, and sharp mind, proving that espionage isn't always about quick wit or dazzling escapes. Sometimes it's about silent persistence and quiet defiance. Virginia Hall's career as a spy didn't follow a typical path. Born in 1906 in Baltimore, Maryland, she came from a privileged background. Her education was extensive, first at Radcliffe College and later in Europe. But her path to espionage was shaped by both tragedy and opportunity. In 1933, while on a hunting trip in France, Hall suffered a severe injury when she accidentally shot herself in the leg. The injury was so severe that her leg was amputated and she was fitted with a prosthetic leg. The accident could have ended her career or relegated her to a life of quiet obscurity, but instead, it served as the catalyst for her transformation. Far from a woman who would retreat from the world, Hall showed extraordinary resilience, even giving her prosthetic leg the name Cuthbert. The loss of her leg did not break her spirit. Instead, it strengthened her resolve to prove that she could still lead an adventurous life. Her injury was a challenge, but one she would not allow to define her. Hall was determined to follow a path that would take her beyond the boundaries of traditional expectations. She entered into a career in foreign diplomacy and worked for the US State Department. It was here that she would be exposed to European politics, as well as the growing tensions of pre-World War II Europe. During this time, Hall became increasingly aware of the Nazi threat in Europe, which led her to consider a more direct role in the fight against fascism. When the war broke out in 1939, Hall sought a more active role. Her diplomatic career brought her into contact with members of the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, an agency dedicated to carrying out espionage and sabotage against the Axis powers. Recognizing her potential, they recruited her to work in the French resistance, a decision that would alter the course of her life and in many ways change the tide of the war. Virginia Hall's work as a spy began in earnest in 1941, when she was recruited by the Special Operations Executive. Trained in espionage, sabotage, and covert operations, she was sent to France with a singular mission: to assist the French resistance in its efforts to disrupt Nazi operations. At the time, France was under the brutal occupation of Nazi Germany, and the resistance was one of the last hopes of the Allied forces in Western Europe. Hall was not just a spy in the traditional sense. She was deeply involved in organizing the French resistance's activities, providing critical intelligence to the Allies, and helping to facilitate sabotage operations. Her work in France was critical, as she gathered information about German troop movements, supply routes, and military installations. She coordinated missions to disable German communications and worked tirelessly to ensure that the resistance had the tools it needed to carry out its operations. One of Hall's most successful operations involved the sabotage of German military infrastructure in the lead-up to the D-Day invasion. She helped coordinate the activities of several resistance cells, ensuring that vital information was passed to the Allies at the right time. Hall's intelligence also helped to identify key German officers and military leaders, contributing to the overall effort to dismantle Nazi operations in France. Despite the risks, Hall's ability to evade detection was remarkable. Her prosthetic leg, which might have been seen as a liability by many, became one of her greatest assets. The Germans never suspected that a woman with a disability could be capable of such feats of espionage, and Hall used this to her advantage. She never appeared out of place in the wartime chaos of occupied France. Instead, she blended into her surroundings, moving through the streets of Paris and the French countryside with confidence and grace. In 1942, Hall's cover was nearly blown. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, had grown suspicious of her movements and began to close in on her. After a close call with arrest, Hall was forced to leave Paris and go underground. The fear of capture was ever present, but Hall's determination never faltered. She worked in the shadows, coordinating intelligence and continuing to aid the resistance, despite the constant danger. Her escape from France was one of the most dramatic moments of her life. With the help of the British and French resistance, Hall was smuggled across the Pyrenees into Spain, a perilous journey that involved traversing dangerous terrain and evading both the Nazis and collaborators. Once in Spain, Hall was able to make her way to the United Kingdom, where she was hailed as a hero for her bravery and commitment. Despite the pressure of the war, Hall's courage did not diminish. She continued to serve with distinction, working alongside other agents of the SOE, providing intelligence and supporting the efforts of the Allies. Her name was kept out of the public eye, as her mission was so secretive that only a few high-ranking officials knew of her work. Hall's contributions to the Allied war effort were monumental, though they remained largely unrecognized during her lifetime. She was awarded numerous commendations for her work in the resistance, but her story was kept quiet, largely out of concern for her safety and the security of ongoing operations. After the war, Hall returned to the United States, where she would later work with the CIA, helping to rebuild intelligence networks and train new recruits. Her quiet, steadfast service during the war was ultimately a testament to the resilience and effectiveness of her character. Though Virginia Hall's legacy has only recently gained widespread recognition, she remains one of the most important figures in the world of espionage. Her bravery in the face of adversity, her ability to infiltrate the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, and her unshakable resolve have made her a symbol of courage and determination. Hall is often remembered as one of the most successful female spies in history, but more than that, she serves as an example of what it means to persist in the face of great odds, to never give up, and to fight for what is right, even when the world seems to be against you. Virginia Hall's life and career as a spy are a powerful reminder that espionage is not just about thrilling stories of spycraft or daring rescues. Sometimes it is the quiet work, the unspoken actions, and the careful planning that make the greatest impact. In an era when intelligence work was often dominated by men, Virginia Hall's story stands as an enduring example of how courage, intelligence, and quiet determination can alter the course of history. Her legacy has been honored in recent years through books, documentaries, and films, but it is not just her historical importance that resonates. It is her resilience, her ability to overcome personal hardship, and her quiet commitment to a cause greater than herself that continues to inspire and captivate those who hear her story. In the quiet shadows of the French resistance, Virginia Hall was not just a spy. She was a silent queen who changed the course of history, one secret at a time. In the world of espionage, few names are as synonymous with intrigue and excitement as James Bond. The fictional British secret agent, whose adventures have captivated audiences for decades, has become the archetype of the suave, daring spy. Yet, as is often the case in the world of espionage, the truth behind the legend is far more grounded and in some ways more fascinating than the fantastical tales we've come to know. James Bond, with his charm, gadgets, and dangerous missions, owes much of his existence to a real man, Ian Fleming, the British author, journalist, and former intelligence officer. Fleming's career as a real-life spy deeply influenced his creation of Bond, shaping not only the character, but the entire world of espionage fiction. And while Bond's exploits may have been outlandish, they were built on a foundation of Fleming's own experiences in the world of intelligence, wartime intrigue, and Cold War tensions. This chapter is a journey into the creation of the most famous spy in history, exploring how Fleming's personal experiences in espionage directly influenced the creation of James Bond, and how the character of Bond, in turn, became a symbol of the 20th century's fascination with spycraft. Ian Fleming, from naval intelligence to fictional spy. Born in 1908 to a wealthy family, Ian Fleming's early life was marked by privilege and adventure. After attending prestigious schools and dabbling in journalism, Fleming's life took a more serious turn when he joined the British Royal Navy during World War II. While his role in the Navy wasn't as a frontline officer, it was within the clandestine branches of British intelligence that Fleming would leave his most significant mark. Fleming was appointed to a position with naval intelligence, where his work involved overseeing the planning of secret operations, especially those aimed at disrupting German U-boat activity and intelligence gathering. During this time, Fleming became increasingly involved in espionage operations, often working closely with figures who would go on to become part of the British intelligence establishment. His exposure to high-level intelligence work, along with the nature of the missions he helped orchestrate, gave him a first-hand understanding of the world of spies, the shadowy, dangerous world that would later be reflected in the adventures of James Bond. Fleming's time in naval intelligence saw him overseeing secret operations that range from espionage missions to clandestine warfare tactics. He was deeply involved in the planning of Operation GoldenEye, a plan to protect Gibraltar from possible Nazi occupation, and worked closely with the special forces and intelligence units that would eventually lay the foundation for Britain's post-war intelligence services. But Fleming wasn't merely an administrator. He had a keen eye for detail and a sharp instinct for understanding the mechanics of espionage. His observations during the war, including his interactions with secret agents, military officers, and government officials, would form the basis of his most iconic creation. When World War II ended, Fleming returned to a more traditional journalistic career, but the world of intelligence had left its mark on him. It was in this post-war period that the seeds of James Bond began to sprout. In 1952, Ian Fleming published Casino Royale, the first of what would become 12 novels and 2 short story collections featuring the iconic British spy, James Bond. Bond was a reflection of Fleming's own experiences and observations during his time in naval intelligence, but he was also the embodiment of the fantasy of espionage, a man who was equal parts suave diplomat, ruthless agent, and adventurous hero. Bond, like Fleming, was a product of British intelligence. He was educated, skilled, and had the heart of a patriot. But Bond was also something more. He was the idealized fantasy version of the man Fleming had encountered in the world of espionage. Fleming himself was known for his own charm and sophistication, and Bond became a reflection of the qualities he admired in spies: decisiveness, confidence, and an almost unnerving calm in the face of danger. Unlike real-life spies, Bond's world was an exaggerated one, filled with extravagant gadgets, dangerous women, and over-the-top villains. But at its core, the world of James Bond still bore the mark of the real espionage Fleming knew so well. Bond's missions often dealt with the same global issues that had dominated Fleming's time in intelligence, including nuclear threats, Cold War politics, and shadowy organizations with world-altering ambitions. Fleming's personal experiences as a spy gave him the ability to write with an authenticity that made Bond's world feel real, even when it ventured into the realm of the fantastic. The fast-paced action, the cool composure in the face of danger, and the intricate plots all had roots in the real world of espionage, making Bond's escapades an enthralling, albeit exaggerated, mirror of the real dangers that existed in the post-war world. Bond's creation was not simply the result of Fleming's imagination. It was deeply inspired by the figures Fleming encountered in his years of service in naval intelligence. Though Bond's charisma and lifestyle were enhanced for entertainment, many aspects of his character came from real intelligence officers and covert operations that Fleming had been involved with or had heard about during the war. One key influence on Bond was The Man Who Never Was, a deception operation that saw a dead body planted with false intelligence in a bold attempt to mislead the Nazis. The story became one of Fleming's favourite anecdotes, and was later reflected in the outlandish, often elaborate schemes that Bond would face in his missions. Much like Bond, the agents of real espionage operations during World War II were required to work under constant threat, using their wits and training to outmaneuver their enemies. Another key influence came from Fleming's own colleagues and the spies he worked with. They were often glamorous figures, involved in high-stakes operations, moving between countries and navigating complex political landscapes. The influence of these men, as well as Fleming's interactions with them, seeped into Bond's character. Bond's impeccable manners, his taste for the finer things in life, and his unflappable confidence mirrored many of the figures Fleming had known in his own intelligence career. But while Fleming drew inspiration from the real spies he encountered, he also injected Bond with an idealized persona that was unshakable, sophisticated, and, perhaps most importantly, invincible. Bond's world was one of exaggerated elegance, where danger was always at arm's length, but Bond emerged unscathed, ready for the next adventure. This aspect of Bond's character made him not just a spy, but an icon, someone who embodied the ultimate fantasy of power, danger, and excitement. One of the most notable aspects of the Bond novels was the way they merged the reality of espionage with the sense of escapism. Fleming's James Bond was not just a spy, he was a symbol of post-war escapism, a figure who represented the triumph of British power and resilience in a time when the world was still recovering from the ravages of the war. Bond's missions were often set in exotic locations, his adventures taking him from the frozen landscapes of Russia to the sun-drenched shores of the Caribbean, with each new locale offering a new danger, a new challenge, and a new villain to defeat. These locations were often chosen for their appeal to the reader's sense of adventure and desire to escape the mundane. Just as much as Fleming wanted to capture the tense, gritty world of espionage, he also wanted to give readers a reprieve from the harsh realities of post-war Europe. In this sense, Bond's stories were not just espionage thrillers, they were vehicles for fantasy. Bond was a character who seemed to live out the dreams of every man, overcoming every obstacle, charming every woman, and ultimately saving the world. His suave demeanor and cool-headedness in the face of danger were a form of escapism that gave the audience a sense of empowerment and relief. The character of James Bond became so iconic that it transcended the world of novels and entered into the realm of film. Starting with Dr. No in 1962, Bond's adventures on the big screen took the world by storm, with Sean Connery's portrayal of the character cementing Bond's place as the ultimate spy. The Bond films, while incorporating much of the original fiction, took on a life of their own, creating an enduring franchise that would continue for decades. As the years passed, the character evolved with the times, adapting to the changing nature of espionage and international relations. However, the core of Bond remained the same. A suave, charismatic agent who represented the best, and sometimes the worst, of the spy world. Today, James Bond remains one of the most enduring fictional characters in history, and his legacy is inextricably linked to Ian Fleming's personal experiences in the world of espionage. Fleming's work continues to inspire, capturing the excitement, mystery, and dangers of the spy world, all while offering readers an exhilarating escape into a world of covert operations, shadowy figures, and thrilling adventures. Though James Bond originated in the pages of Ian Fleming's novels, it wasn't until the character transitioned to film that he truly became a worldwide cultural icon. Bond's on-screen debut came in 1962 with the release of Dr. No, starring Sean Connery in the role that would define the character for decades. But what made Bond not just a successful literary figure, but a cinematic legend? Bond films are often more than mere spy thrillers. They're cultural touchstones, showcasing a particular vision of masculinity, power, and adventure that have kept audiences riveted for over half a century. The films, initially based on Fleming's novels, quickly evolved into a franchise that blended action, humor, and gadgets, defining the spy movie genre for generations. While Ian Fleming's Bond novels established the character as a suave, deadly, and intelligent secret agent, the films made Bond a global sensation. The first film, Dr. No, introduced audiences to the essentials of the Bond formula: fast cars, beautiful women, exotic locations, and dangerous villains. But it also set a precedent for Bond's distinctive traits: his calm under pressure, his quick wit, and of course, his charm. Sean Connery's portrayal of the British spy was an immediate hit, and he went on to define the role for the next few decades. Connery's Bond was not just an agent working for MI6. He was a larger-than-life hero who effortlessly blended deadly skills with sophisticated charm. His Bond was cool, collected, and always in control, often facing perilous situations with a wry smile. The success of Dr. No, and the subsequent Bond films helped solidify the spy genre as one of the most lucrative and popular genres in cinema. But Bond's cinematic success wasn't just about Connery's performance. It was also about the elements of the films, the lavish sets, the memorable theme songs, the high-tech gadgets, and the exotic locations. Dr. No showcased Jamaica's tropical landscapes, From Russia with Love, 1963, presented the cold backdrop of Istanbul, and later films would take us from the Swiss Alps in The Spy Who Loved Me, 1977, to the streets of Paris and even the ice-capped mountains of Norway. From the very first film, Bond movies followed a certain formula, a template that remained largely consistent throughout the years. The formula included several key elements that fans had come to expect, including the villain, a nefarious character, often with grandiose plans for world domination, served as the central antagonist. Villains like Dr. No, Goldfinger, and Ernst Stavro Blofeld became synonymous with Bond films. The Bond girls, the female characters, often depicted as beautiful and intelligent, became iconic in their own right. From Ursula Andress in Dr. No to Halle Berry in Die Another Day, 2002, the Bond girls added both glamour and intrigue to the films. The gadgets, Bond's arsenal of gadgets, from the iconic Aston Martin DB5 with its ejector seat to the invisible car in Die Another Day, became integral to the film's appeal. These gadgets, often supplied by Q Branch, allowed Bond to navigate complex situations with a flair for technology and innovation. The action sequences, high-stakes chases, shootouts, and daring escapes were a staple of the Bond franchise. The action wasn't just about physical confrontation. It was about showing off the extraordinary lifestyle and skills of the man himself. The cool, suave Bond. Bond's charisma was a defining characteristic. He never lost his cool, whether he was facing certain death, outsmarting a villain, or seducing a woman. His smooth demeanour, sharp wit, and effortless sophistication set him apart from other action heroes. As the years passed and the franchise continued to evolve, so too did the character of James Bond. Connery's early portrayal of Bond in the 1960s and 1970s set the bar high, but the character would go on to be portrayed by several different actors, each of whom put their own unique stamp on the role. Roger Moore, who took over the role in Live and Let Die, 1973, brought a more light-hearted and campy tone to the character, reflecting the changing tone of the 1970s. Moore's Bond was suave, charming, and often self-aware, making his films some of the most beloved in the series, even though they sometimes leaned into absurdity and humour. Moore's run lasted until 1985, and during his tenure, Bond movies became synonymous with larger-than-life villains, outlandish gadgets, and ever-increasing stakes. After Moore's departure, Timothy Dalton briefly took over the role in The Living Daylights, 1987, and License to Kill, 1989. Dalton's Bond was more serious and closer to the darker, more brooding version of the character portrayed in Fleming's novels. His Bond was an agent with a moral code, willing to take matters into his own hands and challenge authority. However, Dalton's more serious portrayal was not as warmly received by audiences, and he left the role after just 2 films. The next Bond actor, Pierce Brosnan, revived the character with a renewed sense of charm and high-tech action in the 1990s. His first film, GoldenEye, 1995, reinvigorated the series, with a Bond who balanced the suave sophistication of Connery with the action-packed spectacle of the Moore era. Brosnan's Bond was a more modern, tech-savvy agent, and his films often included grandiose stunts and elaborate action sequences. He would go on to play Bond in 4 films, bringing the character into the 21st century. Finally, in 2006, Daniel Craig took over the role with Casino Royale, a film that redefined Bond for a new generation. Craig's Bond was gritty, vulnerable, and more emotionally complex than any previous portrayal. The shift in tone was partly due to a desire to return to the more grounded, hard-edged version of Bond that Fleming had envisioned in his novels. Craig's portrayal emphasized Bond's personal struggles, his commitment to duty, and his internal conflicts, making him perhaps the most human Bond to date. Craig's tenure, which continued through films like Quantum of Solace, 2008, Skyfall, 2012, and Spectre, 2015, brought a new level of depth and maturity to the character. With No Time to Die, 2021, Craig's Bond arc concluded, leaving a legacy of a Bond who was less of a flawless hero and more of a man wrestling with his past and the consequences of his actions. The James Bond films are more than just movies. They are a cultural phenomenon. Bond represents a blend of adventure, danger, and sophistication, qualities that have made him the epitome of what it means to be a modern spy. His enduring popularity is not only due to the film's action-packed sequences and stunning visuals, but also because of the character's complexity, which continues to evolve with each new interpretation. Bond has transcended the world of espionage fiction to become a pop culture icon, influencing everything from fashion to language. The tuxedo, the vodka martini, the famous shaken, not stirred line. These are just some of the elements of Bond's persona that have entered the collective consciousness. His adventures, though often fantastical, also reflect the real-world fears and anxieties of the times, from the Cold War to the post-9/11 era. But Bond is also an escapist fantasy, a figure of indomitable strength and cool detachment who always prevails no matter the odds. The portrayal of Bond as a man who's both the ultimate spy and the ultimate survivor has kept audiences captivated for over half a century, and the series shows no sign of slowing down. In the end, what makes James Bond such an enduring character isn't just his daring missions, suave personality, or the gadgets at his disposal. It's the fact that he embodies the fantasy of the perfect spy, the one who can navigate danger, love, and intrigue with equal skill. From Fleming's pages to the silver screen, Bond has captivated generations, providing a window into the world of espionage through the lens of a man who lives as much for the thrill as for the duty. James Bond may have begun as the product of Fleming's own experiences in naval intelligence, but he has grown into something far larger, a global symbol of adventure, mystery, and elegance. Whether he's saving the world or simply flirting with danger, Bond's legacy endures, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are the ones that begin in the quiet shadows of espionage. In the shadowy world of espionage, where identities are constantly shifting and truths are hidden beneath layers of deception, one name stands out among the early 20th century's most daring and enigmatic spies: Sidney Reilly. Known as the Ace of Spies, Reilly's career was marked by a string of audacious operations, daring escapes, and mysterious actions that have become the stuff of espionage legend. A Russian-born spy with the ability to assume any persona, Reilly infiltrated both British and Russian intelligence circles, using charm, intellect, and sheer audacity to accomplish missions that few would have dared to attempt. But beyond his remarkable successes, Reilly's life was also shrouded in mystery, and his death remains one of espionage's greatest unsolved puzzles. Did he die as a result of his own daring operations? Or was his death the result of betrayal? Was he a loyal agent for the British government? Or did his true allegiances lie elsewhere? In this chapter, we explore the life and legacy of Sidney Reilly, a man who moved in and out of shadows, never fully revealing his true identity or his true motivations. Sidney Reilly was born in 1874 in Russia, though much about his early life remains unclear and heavily debated. Reilly's true birth name is thought to be Sigmund Rosenblum, and some sources suggest he was born to Jewish parents in the small village of Odessa, though other accounts claim he was born into a more affluent family. Regardless of the specifics, Reilly's early life was one of upheaval and change, marked by his desire to escape the oppressive conditions of Tsarist Russia. Reilly's path into espionage began when he emigrated to England, where he reinvented himself as a suave, charismatic figure who could navigate both British high society and the clandestine world of intelligence. His early work in intelligence took him back to Russia, where he began to infiltrate key Russian political and military circles. Reilly's ability to adopt different identities, along with his charm and wit, allowed him to move effortlessly through multiple social and political spheres. It was in these early days that Reilly began to demonstrate his incredible skill as a spy. He learned the art of infiltration, manipulation, and disguise, becoming an expert at assuming different identities. His mastery of languages, his good looks, and his penchant for creating false identities allowed him to operate under numerous guises, making him an elusive and highly valuable asset for both British and Russian intelligence services. While Riley is often celebrated for his daring exploits as a British spy, his work with both the British Secret Service and Russian intelligence would suggest that he may have been more of a double agent than many accounts imply. He was recruited by British intelligence during the early 1900s, likely due to his fluency in multiple languages and his ability to gain access to powerful political and military figures in both Russia and Britain. During his time working for the British, Riley infiltrated some of the most sensitive political and military operations in Russia, notably providing valuable intelligence about the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian imperial family. He was deeply involved in spying against the Bolshevik government after the revolution, where he worked to undermine the fledgling Soviet state and gather information on its leaders. At the same time, Riley was also suspected of working for the Russians themselves. His ability to move between these two worlds, British and Russian intelligence, raised questions about his true loyalties. Was he working in the service of British interests, or was he playing a much deeper game, using his position to further his own objectives or to serve multiple masters? One of Sidney Riley's most famous and controversial missions was his involvement in a plot to overthrow Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik regime. In 1918, Riley was recruited by the British government to help lead a covert mission to stage a coup against the Bolsheviks and return Russia to a monarchy or a more sympathetic government. The operation, which was part of a broader effort by the Allies to interfere in Russia's internal affairs during the Russian Civil War, involved the infiltration of Soviet political circles, sabotage, and efforts to assassinate key Bolshevik leaders. Riley's plot, known as the Riley Plot or the Anglo-Russian Plot, was ambitious but ultimately failed. The mission to overthrow Lenin was ill-conceived and lacked sufficient support within Russia itself. Riley's involvement was highly controversial, as his actions both jeopardized the stability of the Russian state and revealed a growing willingness among Western powers to intervene directly in the internal politics of other nations. The failure of the Riley plot marked the beginning of his strained relationship with the British government. While his role in the failed coup was not fully exposed at the time, it laid the groundwork for a long-standing suspicion of Riley's true loyalties. Was he a patriot working in the service of Britain, or was he more interested in his own ambitions and survival? Perhaps Riley's greatest strength was his ability to reinvent himself, to take on new identities and operate undetected in multiple political spheres. He was a master of disguise, capable of assuming the role of a dashing aristocrat, a humble merchant, a diplomat, or a revolutionary. His ability to move unnoticed in and out of sensitive environments made him an invaluable asset to both British and Russian intelligence services. One of Riley's most audacious operations occurred in 1917, when he was tasked with infiltrating the inner circles of the Russian Bolshevik government. Disguised as a trusted foreign diplomat, Riley managed to secure key meetings with Lenin's officials and gain critical intelligence about the Bolshevik movement. His ability to charm and manipulate those around him allowed him to play both sides, gathering information for both the British and Russian governments. Riley's skill at disguise extended beyond his ability to change his appearance. He was also a master of persona. He could adopt different accents, mannerisms, and social behaviors, seamlessly blending into whichever environment he needed to infiltrate. His ability to shapeshift in this way made him one of the most effective spies of his era. Despite his success in intelligence work, Riley's career was marked by tension, secrecy, and eventual betrayal. In 1925, Sidney Riley was arrested by the Soviet government, which had long suspected him of espionage. His arrest came after years of operating within Soviet circles, gathering critical intelligence for both British and Russian interests. What followed was one of the most mysterious chapters of Riley's life. While some sources suggest that he was executed by the Soviet authorities, the full details of his death remain unknown. Was Riley betrayed by someone within the British or Soviet intelligence apparatus? Was he sacrificed as part of a broader political strategy by the Soviets? Did he die in the hands of the Bolsheviks, or did he escape and live out his days in obscurity? The mystery surrounding his death has kept historians and intelligence enthusiasts guessing for decades. Sidney Riley's legacy as one of the most daring and elusive spies of the early 20th century is undeniable. His work with both British and Russian intelligence has made him a legendary figure in the world of espionage, and his name continues to inspire both historians and writers of spy fiction. What makes Riley's story so captivating is not just his remarkable achievements as a spy, but also the mystery of his life and death. His ability to navigate the world of espionage with a combination of charm, intelligence, and ruthlessness makes him the quintessential spy, an elusive figure who operated in the shadows and left behind only fragments of his true story. Riley's life and work were the precursor to many of the espionage narratives that would come to dominate the 20th century, from the Cold War spies of the 1950s to the modern-day intelligence operatives that continue to shape global politics. Like the best fictional spies, Riley embodied the intersection of glamour, danger, and secrecy. His career was one of deception and intrigue, and his legacy continues to inspire the world of espionage fiction to this day. Sidney Riley, often referred to as the Ace of Spies, remains one of the most enigmatic figures in the history of espionage. His reputation for daring and audacity made him the quintessential spy of the early 20th century. But beneath the surface of his well-crafted persona were complex motivations, relationships, and espionage operations that not only shaped the course of history, but also left a legacy of uncertainty and intrigue. In this deeper exploration, we'll focus on Riley's key operations, his interactions with espionage networks, and the mysteries surrounding his death. His life wasn't just about thrilling spy missions. It was also about the moral ambiguities of espionage, shifting allegiances, and the personal costs of living a life in the shadows. Sidney Riley's espionage career was deeply intertwined with the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent formation of the Soviet state. After the collapse of the Tsarist regime, Russia found itself in turmoil, with several factions fighting for control. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, emerged victorious, but their hold on power was fragile, and many of the Western powers, including Britain, sought to prevent the rise of communism. Riley's role during this time was multifaceted. Though he was working for British intelligence, he was also deeply involved in undermining the Bolshevik government. His loyalty was to the anti-Bolshevik cause, and he aimed to destabilize Lenin's regime. To achieve this, Riley engaged in covert operations designed to infiltrate the Bolshevik inner circle, gather intelligence, and sow discord within Soviet ranks. One of the most significant operations in which Riley was involved was Operation Trust, a Soviet counterintelligence operation. Riley's participation in this operation illustrated not only his ability to gather vital information, but also his capacity to deceive. The mission involved infiltrating key political circles in the Soviet Union and spreading misinformation to disrupt the Bolshevik government's efforts to consolidate power. Though Operation Trust was a failure, it marked Riley's skill in working undercover, gathering intelligence, and influencing key political figures. Sidney Riley's most audacious and controversial mission was his involvement in a plot to assassinate Lenin and overthrow the Bolshevik government. This plan, known as the Riley Plot or the Anglo-Russian Plot, was orchestrated in 1918 by British intelligence as part of an attempt to remove Lenin and the Soviet regime from power. The plan was as daring as it was ambitious. Riley, working with a team of fellow spies and anti-Bolshevik operatives, was tasked with infiltrating the inner sanctum of the Soviet government, gathering intelligence on Lenin's whereabouts, and organizing a coup. This covert operation was intended to spark a revolution that would replace the Bolshevik government with a more favorable regime aligned with British and Allied interests. The plot, however, was doomed from the start. Internal divisions within the anti-Bolshevik forces, coupled with incompetence and a lack of proper coordination, caused the operation to unravel. Despite Riley's best efforts, the plot was exposed, and the Bolsheviks cracked down on the conspirators. The failure of the assassination attempt on Lenin marked the end of the British-backed efforts to sabotage the Soviet regime. But it was also a testament to Riley's willingness to take significant risks in pursuit of his goals. One of the defining aspects of Sidney Riley's career as a spy was his double-dealing nature. Riley was not simply loyal to one side. He was a man who played multiple factions against each other. His ability to work for both British and Russian intelligence, all while maintaining a range of contacts in high places across Europe, made him a master of manipulation. Riley's duplicity, while serving his personal ambitions, also made him a valuable asset to both the British and Soviet authorities. On the one hand, he was feeding information to British intelligence about Bolshevik activities, while on the other hand, he was assisting the Soviets with operations that benefited them against the British-backed White Russian forces. His ability to manage this double life, without giving away his true allegiances, is what made him both a hero and a suspect in the eyes of those around him. However, Riley's two-faced nature didn't go unnoticed. Internal strife within British intelligence, especially as tensions between communist and anti-communist factions rose, led to suspicion about Riley's true loyalties. In fact, some historians argue that Riley's ability to play both sides was part of his undoing. His eventual arrest and execution by Soviet authorities in 1925, after years of infiltrating both the British and Russian political systems, suggested that his loyalty was, at best, highly ambiguous and at worst self-serving. Sidney Riley's most renowned skill was his ability to assume multiple identities. His gift for disguise and his adaptability in taking on new personas allowed him to blend in anywhere, regardless of the situation or environment. Riley's capacity to manipulate not only his appearance, but also his mannerisms, speech, and behavior was unparalleled. He could move seamlessly through different social circles, from the aristocratic salons of Europe to the revolutionary factions of Russia, all without arousing suspicion. This extraordinary ability to transform himself made Riley a prized asset for British intelligence. He used his charm and knowledge of languages to infiltrate both the Russian nobility and the revolutionary underground, establishing contacts with influential figures on both sides of the conflict. His talent for deception allowed him to operate effectively behind enemy lines, extracting key intelligence while avoiding detection. Riley's reputation as the ace of spies was based not just on his ability to gather information, but also on his aptitude for infiltration. His operations was marked by a combination of strategic planning, manipulation, and keen psychological insight into human behavior. For him, the world of espionage was less about brute force and more about understanding the human psyche, how to exploit weaknesses, influence decisions, and stay one step ahead of the enemy. Sidney Riley's death remains one of the most mysterious aspects of his life. After his arrest by the Soviet authorities in 1925, he was reportedly executed by firing squad. However, the full details of his death are still unclear. Was he betrayed by someone within the intelligence network, or did his own recklessness lead to his downfall? Some believe that Riley's execution was the result of his involvement in the Bolshevik overthrow plot, or because he had become a liability to both the British and the Soviet governments. Others suggest that Riley's death was the culmination of his double life, and the risk he took in betraying both sides. There are also theories that Riley was executed by the Soviet authorities to cover up his dealings with the British. The lack of concrete evidence and the secrecy surrounding his arrest and execution only add to the intrigue. The truth of Riley's final moments is lost to history, and the circumstances surrounding his death have fueled speculation for generations. Sidney Riley's career as a spy, though marked by betrayal and mystery, left a lasting impact on the world of espionage. His ability to navigate the complex world of international intrigue, infiltrating both British and Soviet intelligence systems, set a precedent for future generations of spies. Riley's influence is still felt today, not only in the field of espionage but also in popular culture. His life has inspired numerous works of fiction, including the popular TV series Riley Ace of Spies, 1983, which dramatized his extraordinary career and his complex relationships with espionage networks. Though his career ended in tragedy, Sidney Riley's legacy as a master of disguise and daring espionage remains cemented in the annals of spy history. His life is a reminder of the shadowy world of intelligence, where betrayal, deception, and high-stakes operations define the lives of those who operate in the shadows. In the charged atmosphere of the Cold War, the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg stands as one of the most controversial and enigmatic espionage trials in American history. The couple, accused of conspiring to pass atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, became the focal point of a political and ideological battle that spanned beyond the courtroom. Their execution in 1953 would ignite fierce debates about justice, national security, and the extent to which fear of communism could drive a country to extremes. The story of the Rosenbergs is one of tragedy, moral ambiguity, and a public thirst for justice that may have led to an irreversible miscarriage of it. Did they truly betray their country, or were they victims of a political system desperate to root out any sign of communist influence during one of the most fraught periods in American history? Their trial, their punishment, and the lingering questions surrounding their guilt continue to shape discussions about justice and the Cold War to this day. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were ordinary American citizens caught in the sweeping currents of a highly charged geopolitical struggle. Julius, born in 1918, was a highly intelligent and politically motivated man. A former member of the American Communist Party, he became a committed advocate for left-wing causes during a time when political ideologies were not just debates, they were matters of national security. After working as an engineer for the US Army Signal Corps, Julius began to seek out more radical political affiliations, which led him to interact with Soviet agents and sympathizers. Ethel, born in 1915, was an elementary school teacher, and though she was more politically moderate than her husband, she became involved in the same radical leftist circles. The couple, by the early 1950s, had 2 young children and lived in New York City, in the midst of a society where fears of communism were rampant. The Second Red Scare, spurred by the rise of the Soviet Union as a global superpower, created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion throughout the US. The government's hunt for communist spies was intense, and the Rosenbergs, through their associations and political beliefs, found themselves in the crosshairs of McCarthyism and the FBI's anti-communist crusade. The Rosenbergs' involvement in espionage began with Julius's connection to Harry Gold, a chemist and courier who was arrested in 1950 for passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Gold was quickly recruited as a witness by the FBI, and through his testimony, the authorities began to unravel a network of spies believed to be working on behalf of the Soviet government. Julius, it seemed, had played a key role in providing classified information about America's atomic bomb research, which he allegedly passed on to Soviet agents. The Rosenbergs' association with the Soviet Union, however, wasn't entirely clear, and much of the evidence against them was circumstantial. Despite this, the US government charged them with conspiring to commit espionage, and their case would become one of the most politically charged and divisive in American history. The trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1951 was emblematic of the ideological divide that characterized the Cold War. The United States was on the brink of a nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, and the fear of espionage and treason was reaching a fever pitch. The Rosenbergs were charged with providing the Soviets with crucial information about the US atomic bomb, thus aiding the Soviet Union in its efforts to develop its own nuclear weapons. The stakes were high, and the government, led by a fervently anti-communist prosecutor Roy Cohn, sought to make an example of the couple. The prosecution's case was largely based on the testimony of Harry Gold, who claimed that Julius had provided him with detailed information about the atomic bomb, which he then passed on to his Soviet handlers. However, when it came to Ethel, the evidence was much less clear. The prosecution argued that she'd been complicit in her husband's activities, having allegedly typed up documents related to the espionage. Ethel's role in the case was debated for years, with many scholars and later legal experts questioning whether she was truly involved or whether she had been unjustly implicated to increase the severity of the charges against her husband. The trial was controversial from the start, with many arguing that the case was more about ideological persecution than about concrete evidence. The Rosenbergs' defense team argued that they were being unfairly targeted due to their political beliefs, and they denied any involvement in espionage. The couple's Communist Party affiliations, their ties to left-wing groups, and their outspoken views on government policy became central to the prosecution's argument that they were traitors, regardless of whether there was definitive proof of their espionage activities. The trial was conducted in an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. The atmosphere surrounding the trial reflected the broader climate of anti-communist sentiment that gripped the US at the time. The government, having recently witnessed the rise of Soviet nuclear capabilities and the spread of communism across Europe and Asia, was desperate to root out any internal threats. The Rosenbergs were viewed as convenient symbols of a much larger ideological battle. They were accused of betraying the American people, and their trial was as much about sending a message as it was about justice. On March 29, 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were found guilty of conspiracy to commit espionage and sentenced to death by electric chair. Their trial and conviction marked a watershed moment in American legal history, as the case became emblematic of the larger questions about justice and morality during the Cold War. The Rosenbergs were convicted largely on circumstantial evidence, with much of the case relying on the testimony of unreliable witnesses and questionable evidence. But the case had taken on a life of its own, and the public and government alike demanded a harsh punishment. The execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg on June 19, 1953, at the age of 35 and 37 respectively, was one of the most controversial in US history. Their deaths, carried out amid widespread protests and appeals for clemency, raised profound moral and legal questions. Were they truly guilty of espionage, or were they innocent victims of a society gripped by fear? The execution, which occurred during the height of the Cold War, seemed to embody the tensions of the era, a time when national security was often considered more important than civil liberties, and when political beliefs were enough to warrant death sentences. The execution sparked worldwide outrage, particularly from the left-wing communities in the United States and abroad, who saw the Rosenbergs as martyrs to a cause. Many believed that the Rosenbergs had been sentenced not because of concrete evidence, but because of their political affiliations. Their trial and subsequent deaths became a rallying point for those who criticized the growing anti-communist fervor in the US. It was an execution driven not just by legal concerns, but by the political climate of the time. In the decades following their deaths, the case of the Rosenbergs has continued to stir up controversy. Were they truly Soviet spies? Or were they innocent victims of a political system obsessed with rooting out communism? Many historians and scholars have revisited the case, with some arguing that the Rosenbergs were guilty of espionage, while others maintain that they were wrongfully convicted and executed. One of the key points of contention lies in the role of Ethel Rosenberg. While Julius was clearly involved in espionage, the evidence against Ethel remains murky. Some argue that she was complicit in her husband's activities, while others maintain that she was only indicted to leverage a harsher sentence against Julius. In 2008, new evidence was revealed, including declassified documents from the Soviet Union, which suggested that Julius had indeed passed atomic secrets to the Soviets. But the information on Ethel's involvement was far more ambiguous. Furthermore, many have pointed out the political context of the trial. At the height of McCarthyism, the US was deeply paranoid about communist infiltration, and many believe that the Rosenbergs were made scapegoats in a larger ideological battle. This climate of fear, coupled with the prosecution's desire for a conviction, led to what some consider a miscarriage of justice, one that has left a stain on America's legal history. The case of the Rosenbergs, and their subsequent execution, continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of political extremism, the unchecked power of the state, and the fine line between national security and individual rights. Their story remains a symbol of the turbulence of the Cold War, a period when suspicion, fear, and political ideology could shape the very course of justice. As the years go by, the debate over the Rosenbergs' guilt or innocence continues to elicit strong opinions. Were they spies working for the Soviet Union, or were they simply caught in the crossfire of a paranoid and repressive political environment? While we may never know the full truth, the story of the Rosenbergs is a tragic reminder of the costs of political extremism and the consequences of moral questioning in a time of turmoil. The world of espionage is a shadowy realm where loyalty, secrecy, and trust are paramount. In this world, few betrayals are as profound as those that involve individuals who work within the very institutions that are meant to protect national security. Aldrich Ames, a high-ranking CIA officer, became one of the most notorious double agents in US history when he turned against his country and began to provide highly sensitive intelligence to the Soviet Union. His story is one of personal greed, moral decay, and the devastating consequences of espionage on both an international and personal level. Ames's motivations for betraying his country are a complex mix of personal frustration, financial desperation, and ideological disillusionment. Yet, the true extent of the damage he caused, and the lives lost due to his actions, remains a chilling reminder of the ethical dilemmas faced by those who work in intelligence. This chapter explores the life of Aldrich Ames, the damage he inflicted upon the CIA, his eventual capture, and the dark revelations that surfaced in the wake of his treachery. Aldrich Hazen Ames was born on May 26, 1941, in River Falls, Wisconsin, to a family with a background steeped in military service. His father, a career army officer, instilled in him a sense of duty and discipline. Ames joined the CIA in 1962, seeking to serve his country. As a young officer, Ames displayed all the qualities necessary for success in the intelligence community: intelligence, ambition, and a sharp mind. He quickly rose through the ranks, eventually reaching a position that allowed him access to highly sensitive information regarding Soviet operations and the identities of US spies in the Soviet Union. However, Ames's early career was not without difficulties. His personal life, especially his marriage, was marked by instability. Ames was married twice, and both relationships were tumultuous. His financial situation became strained, and it was around this time that he began to entertain thoughts of betrayal. His second marriage, to a woman named Maria del Rosario Casas, would play a significant role in his decision to turn to espionage as he sought to improve his financial status. In the early 1980s, Ames found himself disillusioned with his life at the CIA. He struggled with feelings of underappreciation and dissatisfaction with the work he was doing. He was frustrated by his lack of advancement within the agency and the recognition he felt he deserved. This dissatisfaction, combined with personal struggles, began to erode his sense of loyalty to the United States. By 1985, Ames had begun to engage in espionage. Motivated by a combination of greed, frustration, and disillusionment, he reached out to the Soviet Union, offering to sell them classified information in exchange for money. Ames's decision to turn was not a sudden one. It was a slow descent into moral ambiguity, driven by a mixture of personal discontent and financial desperation. He began passing secrets to the Soviets, starting with a small amount of information, before eventually providing them with highly sensitive intelligence. Ames' motivations for turning against his country remain a topic of much debate. While some argue that financial gain was the primary motivator, Ames received a substantial amount of money from the Soviets. Others point to his ideological disillusionment as a driving factor. Ames had been deeply frustrated by the CIA's operations against the Soviet Union and was disillusioned by what he saw as American imperialism and the Cold War mentality. The more he felt disillusioned, the more his sense of loyalty to the United States began to unravel, ultimately leading him to spy for the Soviet Union. Ames's betrayal was further complicated by the fact that he held a position that gave him access to some of the most sensitive intelligence held by the United States. As a CIA counterintelligence officer, Ames had access to the identities of US spies operating within the Soviet Union, and it was these individuals who would bear the brunt of his actions. The scope of Ames's betrayal was staggering. Over a period of several years, Ames provided the Soviet Union with an extraordinary amount of classified information, including details about the CIA's operations in Eastern Europe, Asia, and within the Soviet Union itself. His actions led directly to the exposure and execution of numerous CIA informants who'd been operating within the Soviet Union. The scale of the damage Ames caused became apparent only after his arrest, when intelligence officials realized that many of their most trusted assets had been compromised and that some had been executed by the Soviet government. The precise number of lives lost due to Ames's betrayal is not known, but it is believed that his actions resulted in the deaths of at least 10 CIA agents. These agents, whose identities were exposed as a result of Ames's information, were executed or imprisoned by the Soviet authorities. In addition to the human cost, Ames also provided the Soviets with highly classified operational details that crippled US intelligence efforts against the Soviet Union. Ames's betrayal was made all the more devastating because of his position within the CIA. As a senior officer in the agency's counterintelligence division, Ames had access to the agency's most sensitive secrets. He was in a position of trust, and yet he chose to undermine that trust by betraying the very people who had once relied on him. For years, Ames's betrayal went undetected. The CIA and the FBI were unable to uncover the source of the leaks, despite mounting evidence that US intelligence had been compromised. Ames continued to live a double life, working within the CIA by day and passing secrets to the Soviets by night. His work was so carefully hidden that even his colleagues remained unaware of his actions. However, in 1993, after an exhaustive investigation, Ames was finally caught. The turning point came when the FBI discovered discrepancies in his financial situation. Ames was living far beyond his means, purchasing expensive items and accumulating significant wealth, despite his relatively modest salary as a government employee. This raised suspicions within the agency, and after further investigation, the FBI uncovered evidence of Ames' espionage activities. Ames was arrested on February 21, 1994, and charged with espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including wiretaps of his communications with Soviet officials and financial records that showed a clear connection to Soviet intelligence operatives. His arrest marked the culmination of an investigation that had lasted for years, and the discovery of his betrayal sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. Aldrich Ames' trial began in 1994, and it quickly became clear that his actions had caused irreparable damage to US intelligence operations. During the trial, Ames' defense team argued that his actions were driven by personal frustrations and financial pressures, rather than any ideological motivations. However, the prosecution presented a damning case, detailing the extent of the damage Ames had caused and the lives that had been lost as a result of his actions. In April 1994, Ames pled guilty to espionage charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His conviction was a sobering reminder of the dangers posed by internal espionage, especially when the betrayer is someone who holds a position of trust and authority. Ames's betrayal not only exposed the vulnerabilities within the US intelligence community, but also served as a cautionary tale about the complexities of loyalty, personal ambition, and the moral dilemmas faced by those working in high-stakes environments. Aldrich Ames' story raises difficult ethical questions that continue to be debated today. Was he driven solely by greed, or was there a deeper ideological rift that led him to betray his country? His actions have been analysed through various lenses, some viewing him as a man corrupted by personal desires, while others argue that his disillusionment with the US government and his dissatisfaction with the state of the world at the time played a critical role in his decision to defect to the Soviet Union. Even more profound is the question of justice. Ames's actions caused immeasurable harm to the United States, and many of the consequences of his betrayal are still being felt today. His case serves as a painful reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in espionage, where loyalty can be a fragile commodity, and where the decisions of one individual can have far-reaching and irrevocable consequences. The case of Aldrich Ames remains one of the most devastating and controversial espionage incidents in modern history. His betrayal resulted in the deaths of numerous US agents, compromised vital intelligence operations, and exposed the weaknesses within American national security. Ames's story, however, is not just one of espionage. It is also a reflection on the human condition, the dangers of unchecked ambition, the ease with which a person can be corrupted, and the moral complexities of loyalty and betrayal. As the CIA and other intelligence agencies continue to learn from Ames's case, his legacy serves as a cautionary tale for future generations of operatives, reminding them of the profound responsibility they carry and the weight of the choices they make in the shadowy world of espionage. The story of Aldrich Ames is not one that can be easily forgotten. It's a tale that illustrates the fragility of loyalty, the temptations of personal greed, and the devastating impact that one individual's decisions can have on a nation's security. His actions, though driven by complex motives, ultimately revealed a deep moral void, a betrayal not just of his country, but of his colleagues, his family, and the very system that had entrusted him with such immense responsibility. The question remains, how does one explain the betrayal of a man who'd been so deeply embedded in the fabric of US intelligence? Ames's story, tragic and unsettling, forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ethics, trust, and the psychology of espionage. On one level, Ames's betrayal can be understood through the lens of personal dissatisfaction and disillusionment. Ames, a man who had dedicated much of his life to serving his country, seemed to have reached a breaking point in the early 1980s. His financial woes and frustrations within the CIA likely created a perfect storm of motives that made espionage seem like a tempting escape. But Ames's motivations were not purely personal. The context of the Cold War, a period marked by ideological warfare, is crucial to understanding his actions. The Soviet Union, with its promise of ideological solidarity in opposition to the Western capitalist world, may have been an appealing alternative for Ames, especially given the prevailing political climate of the time. The more he grew frustrated with the direction of US foreign policy and the CIA's role within it, the more his loyalty to the United States seemed to erode. In some ways, Ames could have viewed his actions as a personal rebellion against a system he felt was flawed, using his position to alter the geopolitical balance in favor of the Soviet Union. Yet, this ideological rebellion did not justify the immense cost of his actions. His betrayal came at the expense of human lives, countless CIA operatives who were either killed or imprisoned as a direct result of the intelligence Ames provided to the Soviets. In many ways, this is the tragic paradox of espionage. Agents often operate in the shadows, where they can justify their actions as part of a greater cause or mission, while losing sight of the human consequences that accompany those choices. Ames was, after all, a man with intimate knowledge of how intelligence operations worked, and his understanding of the fragility of human life within these operations made his betrayal all the more devastating. The consequences of Ames' actions extended far beyond the human toll. His espionage activities were a severe blow to the CIA, which had already been grappling with internal struggles during the Cold War. The loss of so many informants in the Soviet Union and the subsequent compromise of intelligence operations had a profound impact on the ability of US intelligence agencies to gather reliable information from behind the Iron Curtain. Ames' betrayal compromised decades of intelligence work, and his espionage activities caused a ripple effect that disrupted US efforts to monitor the Soviet Union during one of the most critical periods in the Cold War. The political fallout from Ames's actions also led to widespread distrust within the intelligence community. The betrayal exposed significant gaps in security, raising concerns about the potential for future infiltrations and further cases of espionage. Ames's case served as a painful reminder of the vulnerabilities within intelligence agencies, where individuals who hold positions of immense trust can be swayed by personal ambition or disillusionment. This was particularly significant in the context of the Cold War, when both the Soviets and Americans were competing for dominance in an increasingly volatile geopolitical landscape. In the years following Ames's arrest, the CIA implemented sweeping reforms to strengthen its internal security measures. These changes included more rigorous background checks, better monitoring of employees, and increased efforts to detect signs of espionage within the agency. Yet, the damage done by Ames' betrayal could never be fully undone. His case remains an indelible part of intelligence history, teaching future generations of spies and operatives the risks and moral pitfalls that accompany the high-stakes world of espionage. Aldrich Ames's story raises difficult ethical questions about loyalty and betrayal, especially in the context of espionage. At its core, espionage is built on the premise of trust. Trust in one's country, colleagues, and the system that governs the work. But what happens when that trust is broken, when an agent who is sworn to protect national security turns against it? The line between loyalty and betrayal becomes increasingly blurred, and the consequences of such actions are both profound and lasting. Ames's betrayal wasn't just a personal failing, it reflected a moral compromise that is inherent in the world of espionage. The decisions spies make are often morally complex, torn between duty to their country and the realities of the political systems they serve. In Ames' case, he justified his betrayal as a response to personal grievances and financial difficulties. But in doing so, he compromised his duty to protect the very lives he had sworn to safeguard. This ethical dilemma is amplified by the idea of justifiable espionage, where, in the eyes of the spy, their actions might be deemed necessary for a greater cause. Ames, disillusioned by what he perceived as the failures of his own country, may have convinced himself that his actions were not merely a betrayal, but an ideological stand against an unjust system. But, as his case shows, the reality of espionage often involves a much darker and more personal cost. The long-term impact of Aldrich Ames' betrayal cannot be overstated. His espionage activities are now considered one of the greatest breaches of trust in US intelligence history. Beyond the loss of life and compromised intelligence, Ames's actions reshaped the way espionage and intelligence operations are conducted. Agencies like the CIA, once trusted to safeguard the nation's secrets, were forced to confront the painful reality that such betrayals can happen within the ranks. Ames' case also highlights the moral complexities of espionage, and how the line between heroism and treason can sometimes be a matter of perspective. For the Soviet Union, Ames was a hero, an agent of change who contributed to their cause. But for the United States, he was a traitor, a man who had used his position of power and privilege to sell out his country for personal gain. Ames became the embodiment of the dark side of espionage, where the motives are never clear-cut, and the stakes are far higher than the individual lives at risk. Aldrich Ames' story is a tragic one, not only because of the lives lost, but also because it underscores the human cost of espionage. The emotional toll of espionage on agents and operatives is often hidden beneath the cloak of secrecy, but when betrayal occurs, that cost becomes all too apparent. Ames's motivations, whether driven by financial strain, personal frustration, or ideological disillusionment, are rooted in the same complex emotions that drive many spies to their work. But his ultimate choice to betray his country resulted in a permanent stain on his life and on the history of intelligence. In the end, Ames' legacy is one of moral ambiguity and human frailty. While his espionage work contributed to the collapse of Soviet power and the eventual victory of the US during the Cold War, it came at a devastating price. His story serves as a sobering reminder of the fragile nature of loyalty and the devastating effects that betrayal can have on both personal relationships and national security. In the world of espionage, the line between illusion and reality is often blurred. Few figures exemplify this duality more than Anna Chapman, the Russian spy who became the face of a high-profile espionage case in the United States in 2008 to 2010. Chapman's story, woven with glamour, mystery and intrigue, is a modern tale of espionage that seems to blur the lines between spy fiction and reality. From her glamorous lifestyle as a New York socialite to her secret role as a Russian sleeper agent, Chapman's double life captivated the public's imagination. Her arrest, along with 9 other members of a Russian sleeper cell, revealed an espionage operation that had been operating in the US for years, beyond the reach of authorities, seamlessly blending into American society. Yet, the more glamorous the life, the darker the secrets behind it. Chapman's case sheds light on the intricacies of modern-day espionage, the art of deception, and the complexity of loyalty in the 21st century. Anna Chapman was born Anna Vasilyevna Kushchenko on February 23, 1982 in Volgograd, Russia. She was raised in an affluent family with a father who worked as a high-ranking diplomat in the Russian government. Her early life was marked by privileges that gave her an education in both Russia and the West. Chapman was intelligent, ambitious, and resourceful from a young age, traits that would serve her well in her future career as a spy. Before her involvement in espionage, Chapman appeared to lead a normal, albeit glamorous life. She moved to London in 2001 to study economics, and eventually settled in New York City in 2009. There, she quickly became part of the city's social scene, rubbing shoulders with the elite. She reinvented herself as a successful businesswoman, founding a company focused on real estate investment, and frequented the trendy spots in Manhattan. Her life seemed a far cry from the shadows of espionage, until the day her true identity was uncovered. Chapman was part of a larger Russian sleeper cell, a group of agents who had been planted in the US for the purpose of gathering intelligence over long periods of time, blending into American society without raising suspicion. These agents, often referred to as deep cover operatives, had been living under assumed identities for years, quietly collecting information on the US political and economic landscape. Chapman, like the others in her cell, was not immediately tasked with espionage, but had been trained to do so once she had successfully embedded herself in American society. Her glamorous lifestyle, complete with upscale social gatherings, was a carefully constructed facade to maintain her cover. By day, she appeared to be a successful businesswoman, networking and gaining access to influential figures in the US political and business world. By night, She was an operative gathering intelligence for the Russian government. She had successfully lived this dual life for years without raising suspicions, operating under the radar and maintaining her cover as a socialite. The spy ring of which Chapman was a part was one of the most significant espionage operations to be uncovered in recent years. Known as the Illegals Program, it was a covert Russian intelligence operation in which agents who had been planted in the US for years operated as sleepers. These agents were sent to the US in the early 1990s and were tasked with blending into American society, gathering intelligence, and infiltrating key political and business circles. Their role was to collect information on US policy and economics, especially regarding nuclear weapons, military capabilities, and the country's relations with Russia and NATO. These agents were not tasked with carrying out immediate high-profile operations, but instead, their role was to lay the groundwork for long-term intelligence gathering. For many years, they lived seemingly ordinary lives, working at regular jobs, attending social events, and building relationships that would eventually serve the Russian state. Anna Chapman, for example, was able to gain significant access to American business and political circles, all the while using her charm and beauty as tools to gain trust and influence. The fact that she was able to keep her cover for so long speaks to the extraordinary training that these sleeper agents underwent. They were taught how to operate seamlessly in foreign environments, how to blend into their surroundings, and how to extract information from their targets without drawing attention to themselves. The operation was carefully orchestrated, with the agents using encrypted communications and clandestine meetings to report their findings back to Russian intelligence agencies. Chapman's role was not to undertake high-risk assignments, but rather to establish a position from which she could gather valuable intelligence. Like many sleeper agents, she worked quietly for years, knowing that her cover could be blown at any moment. However, the operational risks were minimized by her ability to disguise her true nature. Chapman's double life came to an abrupt end in June 2010, when she and 9 other members of her Russian sleeper cell were arrested by the FBI. The operation, dubbed Operation Ghost Stories, was a major blow to the Russian espionage program, as it revealed the extent to which the Russian government had been actively infiltrating American society. The FBI had been monitoring the group for years and had gathered evidence of their covert activities. The investigation that led to their arrests was a combination of high-tech surveillance, wiretaps, and traditional intelligence gathering methods. The FBI had tracked Chapman's communications and interactions with Russian operatives, and it became clear that her role was part of a broader network of spies working in the US. By the time the FBI made its move, the sleeper agents had been active for nearly a decade, quietly infiltrating American society. In a dramatic twist, Chapman was arrested just days before she was due to meet with a Russian handler in New York. Her arrest was part of a larger diplomatic exchange, with the US and Russia negotiating the largest spy swap since the Cold War. After her arrest, Chapman and the others were charged with acting as agents of a foreign government without notifying the US Attorney General, a violation of US espionage laws. Chapman was eventually deported to Russia, where she was hailed as a hero by the Russian government. Her arrest and the public spectacle surrounding her trial became a significant event in US-Russian relations, symbolizing the continuing tensions between the two nations despite the end of the Cold War. What made Anna Chapman's case so compelling was not just the nature of her espionage, but the way in which she embodied the modern spy. In many ways, she represented a departure from the traditional image of a spy, a shadowy figure working in secrecy. Chapman was a glamorous woman with a highly visible, almost cinematic persona. She was photographed at social events, posted selfies on social media, and gave interviews to the press. In some respects, she seemed more like a fashion model than a covert operative. Her public persona was carefully constructed, and she became an icon in Russia after her deportation. She appeared on the covers of magazines, made television appearances, and even launched a career as political commentator. Her image, deliberately cultivated in the West, allowed her to carry out her espionage work without raising suspicion. But behind the beauty, the glamour, and the socialite image, Chapman was a trained operative who had been strategically placed to extract critical intelligence from the heart of the US. Her case also highlighted the changing nature of espionage in the 21st century. Unlike the old-school spies of the Cold War, who operated largely through clandestine meetings, dead drops, and complex spycraft, Chapman and her fellow agents worked in a world where social media and modern communication tools could be used as weapons. Her ability to blend in with high society, using her charm and beauty to establish key contacts, reflected the increasing sophistication of modern espionage tactics. Anna Chapman's arrest brought a new kind of attention to the world of espionage. She was not just a figure operating in the shadows, she was a symbol of the modern spy. Her life and her arrest raised questions about the ways in which espionage is evolving and how agents now use new tools and technologies to infiltrate societies. Her glamorous image contrasted sharply with the secretive, shadowy world of espionage, giving rise to a new narrative around spies. The modern spy is no longer just a mysterious figure lurking in the shadows. They can be anyone, and their tools can be as much about social manipulation as about covert operations. Despite the relative simplicity of her mission compared to some of the great historical spies, Chapman's story serves as a reminder of the continued relevance of espionage in our increasingly interconnected world. The nature of espionage may have evolved with the times, but its fundamental principles of deception, subterfuge, and infiltration remain as powerful as ever. In the end, Anna Chapman's life is a complex blend of glamour and darkness, a woman who became both a symbol of intrigue and a cautionary tale about the perils of espionage in the modern age. Few names in the world of espionage evoke the quiet reverence and admiration of Richard Sorge. A German-born journalist turned Soviet spy during World War II, Sorge operated in the shadows, gathering critical intelligence from deep within Nazi-controlled Europe and Imperial Japan. His efforts to penetrate the heart of Japan's military and political elite, while working under a false identity, led to some of the most significant intelligence breakthroughs of the war. His reports about Japan's intentions, particularly regarding the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, are often credited with having altered the course of the war, potentially saving the Soviet Union and ultimately contributing to the defeat of the Axis powers. But Sorge's story is not just one of extraordinary bravery and spycraft, it is also one of ultimate sacrifice. His capture, trial, and execution by the Japanese in 1944 ended his life in tragic irony, as he was hailed as a hero by the Soviet Union only posthumously, long after his death. Despite the odds stacked against him, Sorge's unwavering dedication to his cause and his unique ability to operate in a hostile environment cemented his place as one of the most remarkable figures in the annals of espionage history. Richard Sorge was born in Baku, Azerbaijan, in 1895 to a family of German and Russian descent. His upbringing was marked by an intellectual curiosity and a natural aptitude for languages, which would serve him well in his future espionage career. After finishing his schooling in Germany, Sorge studied philosophy and later became involved in Marxist politics, a belief system that aligned him with the ideals of the Soviet Union. His early political leanings set the stage for his eventual recruitment by the Soviet intelligence service. In the years following World War I, Sorge's political sympathies led him to Moscow, where he became an active member of the Communist Party. His skills in languages and his deep understanding of European political landscapes made him an ideal candidate for espionage work. Sorge's decision to join the Soviet intelligence apparatus was not one driven by the pursuit of fame or glory, but rather by a sense of ideological duty. He believed in the Soviet cause, in the promise of revolution and the eradication of fascism, and this belief would guide much of his life as a spy. In the 1930s, Sorge was stationed in Japan under the cover of a journalist, writing for German publications. Japan, at this time, was a rising military power in Asia, and Sorge's mission was to infiltrate Japanese political and military circles and to report back to the Soviet Union. The timing was critical. World War II was on the horizon, and Sorge's task was to uncover Japanese intentions and the extent of their military activity. What Sorge would uncover in the years to come would shape the course of the war, not only for Japan and the Soviet Union, but also for the rest of the world. Richard Sorge's cover as a journalist allowed him to blend into Japanese society in ways that would have been impossible for a typical foreign agent. Fluent in both German and Russian, Sorge quickly established himself as a trustworthy figure within Tokyo's intellectual and diplomatic circles. He was invited into the homes of military officers, politicians, and high-ranking members of Japan's imperial court, all while maintaining his position as a journalist for German publications. But Sorge's success as a spy was not merely due to his ability to blend in. His true genius lay in his ability to gain the trust of his Japanese contacts, including his role as a confidant to several prominent figures. Among those who unwittingly confided in him was Lieutenant General Oshima Hiroshi, Japan's military attaché in Berlin. Sorge's access to such important figures provided him with critical intelligence, which he passed on to his Soviet handlers with impeccable timing. Sorge's greatest achievement in Japan was his penetration of the Japanese military establishment. By gaining the trust of Japanese officials, he was able to report on the country's military movements, plans for expansion in Asia, and most importantly, Japan's intentions toward the Soviet Union. His most valuable intelligence, however, was his confirmation of the fact that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union despite rumors of a planned invasion. This information relayed to the Soviet Union was a pivotal factor in allowing Joseph Stalin to shift military resources away from the Eastern Front to focus on the German invasion of the Soviet Union. In 1941, one of the most significant intelligence reports Sorge provided was his warning to the Soviet Union about Japan's lack of interest in invading the USSR. At the time, the Soviet Union was deeply concerned about the possibility of a two-front war, with the German invasion from the west and the Japanese threat in the east. Sorge's report, which was based on his insights into the Japanese government's internal deliberations, provided to Soviet leaders with the crucial knowledge that Japan was not preparing to attack the Soviet Union. This allowed Stalin to reallocate Soviet military forces to the Western Front, where they were able to mount a successful defense against the German invasion at the Battle of Stalingrad. Sorge's intelligence also gave the Soviet Union a strategic advantage in the Pacific Theater. By understanding Japan's military plans, the USSR was able to avoid wasting resources on a conflict with Japan and instead focus on its efforts against Nazi Germany. the Soviet Union's ability to remain neutral on the Eastern Front during much of the early years of World War II significantly impacted the war's outcome, as the Germans were forced to fight a single front against the Soviets, stretching their resources thin. Moreover, Sorge's information helped strengthen Soviet intelligence operations by feeding them critical data about Japan's alliances, troop movements, and their position in relation to the United States. His contributions to the Soviet war effort were invaluable, and his work is often seen as a key factor in the eventual victory over Nazi Germany. Despite his extraordinary success as a spy, Sorge's life in the shadows would not last forever. In 1941, Sorge's network of spies in Japan was gradually exposed, and he was eventually betrayed by one of his own agents. His cover was blown, and he was arrested by the Japanese Toko, or secret police, in October 1941. The Japanese authorities, eager to punish someone who had infiltrated their military and political system so thoroughly, subjected Sorge to intense interrogation. Despite his efforts to maintain his cover, Sorge's espionage activities were undeniable. The Japanese authorities, having gathered enough evidence to convict him, charged him with espionage and treason. In 1944, after a lengthy trial, Sorge was sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging on November 7, 1944, in a somber and quiet ceremony. Ironically, the day of his execution was the 27th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, and Sorge was, in a sense, paying the ultimate price for his dedication to the Soviet cause. His death marked the end of a remarkable life spent in the shadows of espionage, but his actions did not go unnoticed. Though his death was little more than a blip in the daily news of the time, his work would be recognized by Soviet authorities only after his execution. Sorge's intelligence had played a pivotal role in the success of the Soviet Union's war effort, and his contribution to the defeat of the Axis powers was finally acknowledged by his superiors. Richard Sorge's legacy is one of quiet dedication, intelligence in the shadows, and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Though his life was cut short, his contributions to the Soviet war effort and to the world of espionage are undeniable. Sorge's ability to infiltrate the heart of Japan's political and military circles, while gathering critical intelligence without detection, makes him one of the most successful and admired spies of the 20th century. After his death, Richard Sorge was posthumously celebrated in the Soviet Union as a national hero. He was awarded the Order of the Patriotic War, and his story was immortalized as part of the narrative of Soviet heroism during World War II. Sorge's espionage career became the subject of books, films, and academic studies, and his name remains synonymous with intelligence-gathering brilliance. In Japan, Sorge's legacy is more complicated. While he is acknowledged in some circles as one of the most accomplished spies in history, his story has been overshadowed by the long shadow of World War II and Japan's eventual defeat. Still, his life as a spy is studied by intelligence agencies around the world as an example of how deep cover operations can change the course of history. Richard Sorge, though not widely known in the West during his lifetime, remains a king among spies, an agent whose intelligence helped shift the course of a world war and whose name will never be forgotten in the annals of espionage. His quiet defiance, moral clarity, and unflinching loyalty to the Soviet cause made him a figure of immense importance during the war. And though his life was short, his legacy will endure as one of the most remarkable and selfless acts of espionage in the modern era. Richard Sorge's legacy as one of the most successful spies of the 20th century is not only attributed to the information he provided, but also to his exceptional espionage tactics. Sorge's success in infiltrating Japan and providing critical intelligence to the Soviet Union during World War II was built on his extraordinary ability to blend in, earn trust, and manipulate his surroundings. His approach was one of subtlety and patience, qualities that made him a master of espionage in an era when both secrecy and trust were paramount. Espionage, particularly during the complex and secretive period of World War II, required agents to possess a multifaceted set of skills. Sorge's methods were honed through years of training and experience, and his approach to intelligence gathering was based on the ability to create and maintain multiple layers of deception. His tactical brilliance can be broken down into several key components: cover identity, psychological manipulation, network building, information extraction, and risk management. One of the hallmarks of Richard Sorge's espionage success was his ability to seamlessly adopt various cover identities. He was not merely operating as a foreign spy working under a fake name. Instead, he created a complex persona that allowed him to gain acceptance and trust in both social and professional circles. Sorge understood the importance of disguise and presentation. He was adept at blending into foreign environments without raising suspicion. In Japan, Sorge was a German journalist for the German newspaper Frankfurter Zeitung, and this was the cover he used to gain access to Tokyo's elite circles. As a foreign journalist, he was able to travel widely and meet influential figures across Japan, from government officials to military personnel. This provided him with valuable access to both political and military intelligence, information that he would later pass back to the Soviet Union. However, his cover went beyond just a simple name and occupation. Sorge carefully cultivated his character, presenting himself as an intellectual and charming figure. He attended social gatherings, spoke with an air of sophistication, and was well versed in German-Japanese relations. His knowledge of languages, including Russian and Japanese, also played a crucial role in his ability to maintain his cover. Sorge knew that to succeed, he had to be able to blend into the background and avoid attracting attention to himself. His ability to move undetected through these circles was a critical part of his success as a spy. Another key element in Sorge's espionage tactics was his ability to manipulate the emotions and minds of the people around him. He understood that the heart of effective espionage was gathering intelligence from individuals, and in order to do that, he needed to be trusted and relied upon by his sources. Sorge was a master at gaining confidence and fostering loyalty, which allowed him to gather vital intelligence from individuals in powerful positions. Sorge's manipulation tactics often involved subtle flattery, charm, and the creation of personal bonds. In a system where friendship and loyalty were highly valued, Sorge used those bonds to gain insider information. His ability to gain access to high-ranking officials was not just about his professional skills, it was about his ability to appear trustworthy and non-threatening, which made people feel comfortable confiding in him. For example, Sorge befriended high-ranking Japanese military officials, such as Lieutenant General Oshima Hiroshi and Kido Koichi, Japan's former foreign minister. These connections were invaluable for Sorge, as they allowed him to gather detailed reports about Japan's military plans and intentions. He was able to infiltrate inner circles that were typically off-limits to foreigners, leveraging his connections to establish himself as a trusted confidant. One of the most brilliant examples of Sorge's psychological manipulation came when he convinced Japanese officials of his loyalty to Japan, even as he was simultaneously spying for the Soviet Union. He aligned himself with the interests of his contacts, using their perspectives to earn their trust and avoid suspicion. Sorge made himself indispensable, and by doing so, he positioned himself as a reliable ally for the very people he was betraying. Sorge's approach to intelligence gathering was highly systematic and strategic. His primary objective was to gather information that could influence the outcome of the war, particularly with regards to Japan's military strategy and intentions toward the Soviet Union. He understood the stakes involved. Providing the Soviet Union with intelligence about Japan's plans was crucial to securing the USSR's eastern borders during the early stages of World War II. To gather this intelligence, Sorge employed several tactics. Direct conversations. Sorge was known for his ability to engage in casual yet informative conversations with his contacts. He asked seemingly innocent questions, probing his sources without revealing his true purpose. His discretion and careful framing of questions allowed him to extract critical details without arousing suspicion. Observing military movements. As part of his cover, Sorge regularly attended meetings with military officials and diplomats, where he could observe military strategies and movements. He often attended discussions about Japanese strategy and Japanese-Soviet relations, providing the Soviets with critical information on troop placements and intentions. Access to sensitive documents. Sorge had access to highly sensitive documents, either directly or indirectly. He would carefully analyze official reports or intercept communications, extracting vital data that would inform the Soviet Union's decision-making. Use of intermediaries. In some cases, Sorge used trusted contacts to relay information, using coded language and hidden messages to pass information. By distancing himself from direct exchanges, he minimized the risk of discovery. Sorge's primary success came from his long-term patient intelligence gathering. He did not expect immediate results, knowing that the most useful intelligence often required years of careful observation. This patience, combined with his ability to extract information subtly, made him invaluable to the Soviet Union. Sorge's ability to operate effectively as a double agent was in part due to his masterful management of risk. He knew that the slightest misstep could expose him and jeopardize the entire operation. Sorge's espionage tactics involved careful avoidance of suspicion and constant vigilance regarding the actions of his peers and his environment. Avoiding overexposure. Unlike many spies, Sorge understood the dangers of excessive visibility. While he had an active social life, he remained relatively unremarkable in public settings. By maintaining a low profile, Sorge was able to avoid attracting attention while still gathering vital information. Maintaining multiple channels of communication. Sorge communicated with Soviet handlers through multiple secure channels, minimizing the risks of interception. By using a variety of secure communication methods, including coded messages and hidden documents, Sorge ensured that his operations would remain clandestine. Constant adaptation. Sorge continually adapted his tactics to the shifting political landscape in Japan. He was keenly aware of internal political movements in the country and adjusted his operations accordingly. If there was a change in the leadership or a tightening of security, Sorge was quick to change his methods to avoid detection. By balancing these elements, Sorge was able to operate with remarkable success for years, without raising suspicion. However, like all spies, his ability to manage risk was ultimately tested when he was arrested in 1941. Despite his skill in managing risk and maintaining his cover for so long, Richard Sorge was ultimately betrayed. In 1941, Sorge was arrested by the Japanese Toko, secret police, after being betrayed by a fellow operative. His capture came after he had provided some of the most critical intelligence during the early years of World War II. Sorge's capture marked the end of an extraordinary espionage career. After his arrest, Sorge was subjected to intense interrogations. Despite his defiance and refusal to betray his Soviet handlers, Sorge's fate was sealed. He was tried, convicted and executed by hanging on November 7th, 1944, for his espionage activities. Richard Sorge's espionage tactics remain a textbook example of stealth, patience, and intelligence gathering. His ability to navigate the complexities of working under deep cover, cultivating trusted relationships, and extracting critical intelligence without suspicion showcases the essence of espionage craft. Sorge's legacy is one of dedication and sacrifice, and his intelligence work played a crucial role in shaping the course of World War II, particularly in the Eastern Front. Though his life ended in tragedy, the methods and strategies Sorge employed continue to influence modern espionage techniques and are studied by intelligence agencies and espionage enthusiasts alike. Sorge's quiet defiance and the skillful application of espionage tactics in the face of unimaginable risk make him one of the most revered figures in the world of intelligence. At the height of the Cold War, espionage was no longer just a matter of personal intrigue or isolated operations. It had become an intricate, highly organized, and methodical system. The Soviet espionage machine, one of the most extensive and sophisticated intelligence networks ever established, was a monumental operation that spanned the globe, impacting geopolitical outcomes, shaping world events, and sowing fear and distrust between the East and the West. Soviet intelligence agencies such as the KGB, the GRU, Main Intelligence Directorate, and the NKVD formed the backbone of the Soviet espionage apparatus. With the fall of Nazi Germany and the onset of the Cold War, the Soviet Union understood that to maintain its position as a global superpower, it would need to employ covert tactics and recruit spies on an unprecedented scale. The intelligence they gathered on everything from military capabilities to political affairs allowed the Soviet Union to position itself as a powerful, sometimes invisible adversary to the West. The system was one of calculated deception, long-term infiltration, and global networks working together with a singular focus: to undermine the United States, its allies, and the Western ideological bloc. This chapter explores the mechanics of this immense network, the methods of recruitment, the operational tactics of Soviet agents, and the shadows in which they operated far away from the public eye. What fueled this colossal espionage effort, and how did it operate at such a vast scale? The Soviet Union's espionage network was a multi-layered system, consisting of several powerful intelligence agencies. At the forefront was the KGB, Committee for State Security, which handled much of the foreign intelligence operations, surveillance, and internal security within the USSR. In its heyday, the KGB was often considered one of the most effective espionage agencies in the world. It was ruthless in its pursuit of intelligence, often using psychological manipulation, blackmail, and subterfuge to turn ordinary citizens and government officials into spies. The GRU, or the Main Intelligence Directorate, was the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. Unlike the KGB, which focused on internal matters, the GRU primarily operated abroad, gathering intelligence on military affairs, political movements, and economic policies in Western countries. The GRU's approach was more operational, running espionage missions and agent networks to extract high-value intelligence on military strategies, technologies, and the deployment of nuclear arms. The NKVD, the predecessor to both the KGB and GRU, had played an essential role during the Great Purge of the 1930s, a campaign by Stalin to eliminate perceived threats within the Communist Party. Though its main focus was on domestic repression, the NKVD laid the groundwork for the operational techniques that would later become integral to Soviet espionage. The recruitment process for Soviet spies was often a mix of ideological alignment, coercion, and calculated selection. The Soviet Union relied on multiple methods to recruit spies, from offering ideological promises to exploiting weaknesses in an individual's personal or financial life. A combination of state-sponsored propaganda and idealistic manipulation was used to turn ordinary citizens, especially those from enemy nations, into loyal Soviet agents. Ideological recruitment. The most ideal recruits were those who shared the Soviet Union's vision of a global communist revolution. During the early years of the Cold War, many of the Soviet Union's spies came from left-wing political movements in the West, particularly the Communist Party or socialist groups. These individuals were often deeply disillusioned with the capitalist system and believed in the ideological promise of a world order dominated by socialist and communist principles. For them, espionage was not merely a job, but an act of political commitment. Coercion and blackmail, the KGB and GRU, also relied heavily on coercion and blackmail. Vulnerable individuals were sometimes compromised by their personal lives, such as financial issues, adultery, or criminal behavior. Once the KGB identified such vulnerabilities, they would leverage them to force individuals into espionage, using threats of exposure or harm to their families. This form of coercive recruitment became common in the later years of the Cold War, particularly as the KGB grew more desperate for reliable intelligence sources. Espionage via deception. Another method of recruitment was the use of false flag operations or disguised recruitment. This included infiltrating foreign governments, offering agents undercover roles in high-profile areas of society, and then enticing targets with false promises. Many individuals had no idea they were being used as agents of the Soviet government, believing they were simply helping out a cause or unknowingly participating in a political mission. The sleepers. A particularly effective form of recruitment was the use of sleeper agents, individuals who would live under false identities for years, often with no immediate operational goals until called into action. These agents were often placed in key roles within government, business, or military institutions where they would gather critical information over long periods. The sleeper program was designed to avoid detection and keep Soviet agents embedded in enemy states for extended periods. Once recruited, Soviet agents were put through rigorous training in espionage tactics. The primary objective of their operations was to gather intelligence that could provide the Soviet Union with a strategic advantage over the West. The Soviets employed a range of espionage techniques to achieve their objectives, relying on deception, stealth, and psychological manipulation. Code breaking and communication. Communication was key in Soviet espionage. Agents were trained to use encrypted messaging, dead drops, and covert communication methods. Messages were often hidden in seemingly innocent objects or conversations to evade detection. Even within the Soviet espionage network, agents needed to exercise caution in their interactions to prevent the exposure of their contacts. Recruiting double agents. Another common tactic was the use of double agents, who worked for both the Soviet Union and an enemy state. These agents were often used to infiltrate enemy organizations, gather intelligence, and feed false information to confuse or mislead adversaries. Some of the most successful Soviet agents were those who operated as double agents, creating webs of deception that extended deep into enemy ranks. The use of propaganda and misinformation. Soviet agents also played a significant role in spreading propaganda. Whether through media outlets, official statements, or covert channels, Soviet intelligence sought to manipulate public opinion and sway political agendas in their favor. Agents within foreign governments often worked as propaganda machines, funneling information to promote Soviet ideals or undermine Western democratic institutions. Infiltration and political subversion. One of the Soviet Union's most ambitious tactics was infiltrating the political structures of rival governments. Soviet agents were deployed in positions where they could access sensitive government information, often using their cover as diplomats, journalists, or businessmen. In some cases, agents worked in highly classified roles within the military or intelligence agencies of Western powers, positioning themselves as trustworthy sources of information. As the Cold War progressed, Soviet espionage continued to evolve. The network that had once been vast and incredibly effective began to show cracks. The KGB's operations became more overt as tensions increased between the United States and the Soviet Union. The rise of modern surveillance technology and counterintelligence efforts by the West also made it more difficult for the Soviet Union to maintain its vast spy network, In the mid-1980s, with the defection of high-ranking KGB officers such as Oleg Gordievsky, the Soviet espionage network began to unravel. As intelligence agencies across the world became more adept at countering Soviet operations, the days of the Soviet espionage machine as it had been originally designed were numbered. With the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, many of its espionage networks were dismantled, and much of the intelligence collected over the years was rendered obsolete. Despite its eventual collapse, the legacy of the Soviet espionage machine remains significant. The tactics and methods employed by Soviet agents continue to influence modern intelligence operations. The concept of deep cover agents, the use of disinformation and psychological manipulation, and the reliance on covert communication remain essential aspects of modern espionage today. While many of the Soviet spies were eventually caught or defected, their operations still serve as a lesson in the art of deception, how intelligence agencies can manipulate and infiltrate the highest levels of society and government with subtlety, patience, and long-term planning. The rise and fall of the Soviet espionage machine stand as a testament to the power of covert influence and the significant role that espionage plays in shaping history. Oleg Penkovsky, a high-ranking Soviet military intelligence officer, remains one of the most significant figures in the world of espionage. His story is one of sacrifice, morality, and patriotism, though his actions are often viewed through the complex lens of betrayal. Penkovsky's decision to become a double agent for the United States during one of the most perilous periods of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, changed the course of history. His actions helped avert a potential nuclear conflict, but the price he paid for his espionage was ultimately death. Penkovsky's motivations, his relationship with the CIA, and his tragic end illustrate the stark choices faced by individuals working in the shadowy world of espionage. Was he a hero for risking his life to prevent global catastrophe, or a traitor for betraying the country that had once trusted him? The line between the two is thin, and his legacy, like the spy world itself, is layered with moral ambiguity. In this chapter, we delve into the life of Oleg Penkovsky, exploring his contributions to US intelligence, the personal sacrifices he made, and the ultimate cost of his actions. Oleg Penkovsky was born on April 23, 1927, in Ziad, Azerbaijan, into a family with a long history of military service. His early life was marked by the totalitarian nature of Soviet society. He rose through the ranks of the Soviet military, ultimately securing a prestigious position as a Soviet military intelligence officer. Penkovsky worked as part of the Soviet Union's GRU, Main Intelligence Directorate, tasked with gathering intelligence on foreign military developments and the political state of adversaries. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Penkovsky became increasingly disillusioned with the leadership of the Soviet Union, especially under the repressive regime of Nikita Khrushchev. Like many within the Soviet military and intelligence services, Penkovsky grew frustrated with the Soviet government's secrecy, its aggressive foreign policies, and the unchecked power of the Communist Party. Despite his outward loyalty to the Soviet Union, Penkovsky began to question whether the security of the world would be safeguarded under Soviet leadership. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Penkovsky, who was privy to high-level intelligence and military strategy, began to recognize the potential consequences of the Soviet Union's nuclear ambitions. He was concerned about the rapid escalation of the arms race and the rising threat of nuclear conflict between the United States and the USSR. The Cuban Missile Crisis, an event that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war in 1962, would become a turning point in Penkovsky's life and a defining moment in his legacy. Penkovsky's decision to become a double agent was not one made lightly. While his disillusionment with the Soviet regime undoubtedly influenced his actions, His ultimate decision to pass on classified intelligence to the United States came from a sense of patriotism and a desire to prevent catastrophic global conflict. As a member of the Soviet military intelligence apparatus, Penkovsky understood the stakes of the Cold War better than most. He recognized that a misstep, a misunderstanding, or a failure of diplomacy could lead to nuclear war, and that the Soviets' brinkmanship during the Cuban Missile Crisis could bring the world to the edge of destruction. His motivation, however, was more than ideological. It was deeply personal. Penkovsky had grown disillusioned with the Communist Party's secrecy and the authoritarian nature of Soviet rule. As a man of intellect and ambition, Penkovsky likely felt stifled in the increasingly paranoid and rigid structure of Soviet society. The constant fear of internal subversion and the oppression of free thought drove him to the conclusion that the world would be better off if Soviet aggression could be curbed. His decision to approach the CIA was a calculated risk. He knew the consequences if he was caught. He would be labeled a traitor, and his execution would be almost certain. Yet Penkovsky felt a responsibility not only to the Soviet people, but to the world at large. He believed that by providing the United States with critical intelligence, he could avert a global disaster, one that was born of misunderstandings and the political gamesmanship of world leaders. His first contact with the CIA came in 1960, when he began supplying them with highly valuable intelligence about Soviet missile capabilities and the Soviet nuclear program. Penkovsky's role as an informant was invaluable. He provided the CIA with crucial information that directly impacted the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He confirmed that Soviet missiles were being deployed in Cuba, and he provided insight into the Soviet Union's strategic military positions. This information allowed the United States to take informed diplomatic and military steps during the crisis, ultimately averting the possibility of nuclear war. Penkovsky's work as a double agent was highly covert, and the risks he faced were immense. The very nature of his role within the GRU meant that any misstep could lead to his discovery, arrest, and execution. Despite the overwhelming risks, Penkovsky continued to pass vital intelligence to the CIA through a carefully orchestrated system of dead drops and covert meetings. He was extremely careful in his communications, ensuring that no one could trace the information back to him. He maintained a highly effective and covert communication system with his CIA handlers, particularly through coded messages and the use of intermediaries. His CIA contacts relied on his intelligence, and Penkovsky's information allowed the US to counter Soviet actions and prepare for potential military confrontations. His most important contribution was related to Soviet nuclear capabilities and missile installations in Cuba. The Soviet Union's deployment of nuclear weapons in Cuba was a central part of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Penkovsky's intelligence directly aided the United States in their negotiations with the Soviet Union. Penkovsky was a man of great patience and discipline. He knew that espionage was not a game of immediate results, but a long-term effort that would require him to live in the shadows, constantly aware of the danger around him. In this way, he was the ultimate professional, a man who had risked his life for the greater good, who had carefully curated his communications, and who had made an enormous personal sacrifice for a cause greater than himself. Despite Penkovsky's best efforts to conceal his identity and maintain his cover, he was eventually betrayed. In 1962, after having provided valuable intelligence for over 2 years, Penkovsky was arrested by the Soviet authorities. His capture was a devastating blow, not only to Penkovsky personally but also to the CIA. who had relied on his intelligence to inform their actions during the Cuban Missile Crisis and in other Cold War operations. The exact details of how Penkovsky was betrayed remain unclear, though there are theories that it may have been the result of a double agent within the Soviet military who turned on him or a defect in his covert communications system. Regardless of the method, Penkovsky's capture was swift and brutal. He was subjected to harsh interrogation, and his betrayal was confirmed. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Penkovsky never gave up his loyalty to the cause he'd espoused. Even in the face of death, he remained steadfast in his belief that his actions were justified, believing that he had done what was necessary to protect the world from nuclear destruction. In October 1963, Penkovsky was tried and convicted of espionage and treason by a Soviet military tribunal. The trial was a sham, with little regard for justice or fairness. Penkovsky was sentenced to death, and on November 16, 1963, he was executed by shooting. His execution marked the tragic end of a man who had once been a hero in the eyes of the West, but who had become a traitor in the eyes of his own country. In the United States, Penkovsky was posthumously celebrated as a hero for his role in averting the Cuban Missile Crisis and providing the intelligence that helped shape US policy during the Cold War. In the Soviet Union, however, he was remembered only as a traitor who had betrayed his country and its leadership. The legacy of Oleg Penkovsky is a complex one. On the one hand, he is hailed as a hero by many in the West, a man who sacrificed everything to protect humanity from the ravages of nuclear war. His intelligence directly contributed to the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and his actions undoubtedly saved lives. On the other hand, Penkovsky is seen as a traitor by the Soviet Union, and by those who believe that loyalty to one's country should always come before ideological conviction. His betrayal of the Soviet Union, especially at a time when the Cold War was at its most volatile, has led some to question his motives and the long-term impact of his actions. For Penkovsky, the moral dilemma he faced was profound. Was he justified in betraying his country to prevent a nuclear war, or did he betray his homeland's sovereignty and cause irreparable harm? This moral ambiguity is at the heart of his legacy, making him one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in the history of Cold War espionage. Espionage, once the province of shadowy figures, clandestine meetings, and covert operations, is now undergoing a monumental transformation. The Cold War-era spies, whose names are etched in history, like Richard Sorge, Aldrich Ames, and Oleg Penkovsky, used their wits and access to secret information to navigate a world of spies and counterintelligence, operating within the confines of classified files, espionage rings, and human agents. Yet, as the world enters the 21st century, espionage itself is evolving, reflecting the increasingly interconnected and digital nature of global society. The next generation of spies, their tools and tactics, will be marked by cyber espionage, social media manipulation, and increasingly sophisticated data harvesting. In a world where governments and corporations are increasingly reliant on technology for decision-making, the tools of espionage have expanded far beyond the traditional methods of infiltration, dead drops, and face-to-face meetings. Espionage today is less about old-school tradecraft and more about navigating a landscape dominated by data, algorithms, and social networks. The risks involved, however, are as high as ever. In this final chapter, we'll reflect on the future of espionage, examining how cyber espionage, social media manipulation, and new intelligence technologies are reshaping the profession of espionage. Just as the world of traditional spying adapted to the realities of its era, so too will the future generation of spies need to operate in a world where information is the new battleground. The rise of digital technology has brought about significant changes in how espionage is conducted. Cyber espionage is now the most prominent form of intelligence gathering. In the past, intelligence agencies focused on acquiring physical secrets, documents, weapons plans, or classified military information. But in today's world, where information is predominantly stored and transmitted through digital means, the battlefield has expanded to include cyberspace. Cyber espionage is now a reality that permeates every aspect of modern intelligence operations. Sophisticated hacking groups, state-sponsored and non-state actors alike, are infiltrating corporate networks, government databases, and even military systems. The infiltration of these systems allows espionage agents to steal classified information, monitor national security plans, and even manipulate public opinion. Modern spies no longer need to infiltrate foreign embassies or meet in darkened alleyways. They can now simply access a foreign government's email system, plant spyware in key infrastructure, or intercept secure communication networks. The ability to breach secure networks remotely allows for an unparalleled level of access. For example, the Stuxnet virus, which was allegedly developed by the US and Israel to disable Iran's nuclear program, marked a new chapter in cyber espionage, where digital sabotage became an essential part of intelligence work. This shift in espionage tactics raises important questions about privacy, sovereignty, and the ethics of digital spying. While traditional espionage focused on gaining physical access to sensitive information, the digital age has made it possible to target the very infrastructure and fabric of a nation without ever physically setting foot in its borders. As cyber espionage becomes more prevalent, another crucial development is the integration of artificial intelligence, AI, and big data into intelligence operations. Today's spies must not only navigate traditional intelligence work, but also master new technologies, such as AI-powered algorithms that can analyze vast quantities of data in real time. AI has the ability to predict trends, identify patterns, and even detect vulnerabilities in digital infrastructure, making it a powerful tool for both attackers and defenders in the realm of espionage. Big data allows for the collection of information on an unprecedented scale. Intelligence agencies can now access vast repositories of data collected from social media platforms, mobile devices, GPS networks, and even IoT devices, Internet of Things. This data can be used to track individuals, predict behavior, and even manipulate political sentiment through targeted ads or coordinated campaigns. Espionage in the digital age has become less about physical infiltration and more about information manipulation and mass surveillance. The most cutting-edge spies of today are not only computer programs and hackers, but they are also data scientists and AI specialists. Their job is to make sense of the massive amounts of data that flow through the modern world, identifying critical patterns that could be used for intelligence gathering or political influence. This intersection between intelligence gathering and data science will define espionage in the 21st century. In an age where social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram shape public opinion and influence elections, these platforms have also become critical tools for espionage. Gone are the days when spies had to infiltrate physical government buildings. Today, intelligence agencies can infiltrate the digital persona of individuals, often with nothing more than a computer and an internet connection. Social media provides a rich environment for gathering intelligence. Profiles, posts, behaviors, and interactions offer a wealth of data to analysts seeking insights into everything from personal relationships to political affiliations. Social media manipulation has become a core aspect of modern espionage, as nations seek to influence foreign governments, disrupt political processes, and sway public opinion. Foreign interference in elections, such as Russia's alleged interference in the 2016 US presidential election, highlights the potential for social media to be weaponized as an espionage tool. Cyber agents, working under the guise of social media bots or troll farms, can create a vast network of fake accounts designed to influence discussions, disseminate misinformation, and generate discord. The reach and speed of social media make it a powerful asset for spies. What's more, the digital footprint left behind by individuals on these platforms can be used to map networks of relationships, identify potential targets, and exploit personal data for intelligence purposes. Today's spies are no longer just armed with physical tools like a briefcase full of documents. They have access to entire lives at the click of a button. While technology will continue to drive espionage forward, the need for human intelligence, HUMINT, will never fully disappear. Human spies, whether embedded within foreign governments or working undercover in high-risk areas, will always be necessary to provide insights that cannot be gleaned through digital means. However, in the future, human intelligence may become increasingly intertwined with technology. Spies may use advanced tools to enhance their own physical capabilities, access encrypted data on the go, or communicate securely with their handlers in real time. Moreover, AI-assisted agents may collaborate with human operatives, analyzing data that informs espionage missions in new ways. As cyber espionage becomes more common, HUMINT agents will be tasked with navigating digital traps, protecting themselves from cyber threats, and maintaining a presence in a highly connected world. As we conclude this journey through the history and future of espionage, one thing becomes abundantly clear. The art of spying is a constantly evolving discipline. From the classic spycraft of the Cold War to the digital espionage of the modern age, the tools, tactics, and methods have shifted dramatically. But at its core, espionage remains about secrecy, trust, and the pursuit of information that can shape global events. Today's espionage landscape is defined by complexity, interconnectedness, and innovation. As technology continues to advance, the tactics employed by spies will only become more sophisticated, more subtle, and more far-reaching. The future of espionage is not just about hacking or information theft, but also about information warfare, manipulation of public perception, and the very fabric of our digital lives. As we watch the digital age unfold, one thing remains certain: espionage, in all its forms, will continue to shape the world's political and economic realities for generations to come. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the secret world of spying. As always, we welcome your thoughts and reflections on these complex and fascinating subjects. Like, comment, and subscribe to continue exploring the many stories of espionage, history, and the lives of those who shape the unseen world. Good night and rest.